Chapter 5. Adjustments. Emma felt the weight of stairs the moment she stepped into Miller's general store. The bell above the door might as well have announced, "Here comes the widow who remarried indecently fast," for all the attention it drew. 3 women browsing fabric swiftly bent their heads together, their whispers carrying just loudly enough for Emma to catch fragments, "Not even cold in his grave," and "Cattle buyer indeed." She straightened her spine and lifted her chin, determinedly placing one foot before the other as she navigated toward the counter where Mr. Miller stood arranging a display of canned goods. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, each step sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden hush. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," she greeted him with forced brightness. "I need a few things today." Herbert Miller's normally jovial face settled into careful neutrality. "Mrs. Thornton, that is Mrs. Blackwood now, isn't it? Congratulations are in order, I hear." "Thank you," Emma replied, unfolding her list with steady hands. "I'll need 5 pounds of flour, 2 pounds of coffee, a bolt of muslin for mending, and whatever penny candy you might recommend for children who've been especially good this week." Miller nodded and began gathering her items, conspicuously avoiding further conversation. The silence felt pointed, accusatory even, but Emma refused to offer explanations where none had been requested. Mrs. Miller emerged from the storeroom, her plump face lighting with poorly disguised interest when she spotted Emma. Unlike her husband, Abigail Miller had never been one to disguise her thoughts behind social niceties. "Well, if it isn't the new bride," she exclaimed, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron as she approached. "My goodness, Emma, you certainly don't let grass grow under your feet, do you? Married again before most of us even knew you were courting." Emma focused on counting coins from her reticule. "Good morning, Abigail. How are you?" "Curious as a cat, if I'm being honest." The storekeeper's wife leaned across the counter, lowering her voice to a stage whisper that could likely be heard on the street outside. "Hardly decent remarrying so quickly, and to a stranger, though I must say, Ada Wilson claims he's handsome enough to explain the rush." The insinuation brought heat to Emma's cheeks. "Mr. Blackwood is an old acquaintance," she said stiffly, "from before I met William. There was nothing improper about our reunion." "Of course not," Mrs. Miller agreed with a smile that suggested exactly the opposite, "though it does seem providential, him appearing just when the bank was about to take your home. Some might call it suspiciously convenient." Emma met the woman's gaze directly. "I call it a blessing, Abigail. The Lord works in mysterious ways." The invoking of divine providence had the desired effect of momentarily silencing Mrs. Miller, whose own church attendance was spotty at best. Emma used the reprieve to finish gathering her purchases, painfully aware of the continued scrutiny from the other customers. "Will your husband be joining you in town soon?" Mr. Miller asked as he wrapped her parcels in brown paper. "I understand he's recuperating from some accident?" "A fall from his horse," Emma confirmed, the lie coming more easily with repetition. "He's staying at the Murphy place until he's well enough to travel. Another week, perhaps." "Cattle buyer, isn't he?" Mrs. Miller interjected, unable to contain herself long. "Strange, though. The cattle drives don't usually come through these parts this time of year." "Caleb deals primarily with private ranchers, not the big drives," Emma improvised. "He was on his way to negotiate a purchase in Wyoming when his accident occurred." The explanation sounded plausible enough to her own ears, though, judging by Mrs. Miller's raised eyebrows, it hadn't entirely satisfied the storekeeper's wife's curiosity. Thankfully, the bell above the door jangled again, announcing a new customer and dividing the store's attention. Emma gathered her parcels, eager to complete her errands and escape the stifling atmosphere of speculation. She had one more stop to make, the bank, and it promised to be equally uncomfortable, though for different reasons. Silver Creek Bank occupied a solid brick building at the center of town, its imposing facade designed to inspire confidence in its stability. Emma paused on the boardwalk outside, gathering her courage. What she was about to do, pay off her mortgage with gold coins of questionable origin, felt dangerously close to criminality, regardless of how Caleb had justified it. "All money is tainted," he'd told her that morning as he counted coins into a smaller pouch for her to carry. "The question is merely whether you can live with the particular taint it carries." Emma wasn't certain she could, but the alternative, losing her home, surrendering her children's security, was unthinkable. Howard Porter looked up in surprise when she entered the bank, his spectacles slipping down his nose as he recognized her. "Mrs. Thornton, that is, I understand. Congratulations are in order." "Thank you, Mr. Porter." Emma approached his desk with determined steps. "I've come about my mortgage." The banker's expression turned regretful. "Yes, well, I'm afraid the situation remains as we discussed. The directors have been quite insistent about proceeding with foreclosure unless payment is made in full." "I understand completely," Emma replied, setting her reticule on his desk. "That's why I've come to settle the account." Porter blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing like a fish suddenly finding itself on dry land. "Settle? The entire amount?" Emma withdrew the pouch of coins, placing it carefully before him. "In full, with interest." For a long moment, Porter simply stared at the leather pouch as if it might bite him. Then, with cautious fingers, he loosened the drawstring and peered inside. The gleam of gold eagles caught the sunlight streaming through the bank's windows, reflecting tiny points of light across his startled face. "This is unexpected," he managed finally. "My husband believes in starting our marriage without encumbrances," Emma explained, the half-truth bitter on her tongue. Porter removed his spectacles, polishing them absently with his handkerchief. "Your husband? Mr. Blackwood, is it? I understand he's in the cattle business?" "Yes." Emma maintained a pleasant expression, though she could feel perspiration gathering at her temples. "He's been quite successful, evidently." Porter began counting the coins with practiced efficiency, though his questions continued as he worked. "Has he been in the trade long? I don't recall hearing his name among the cattlemen who typically do business in this region." "Caleb operates primarily out of Kansas," Emma replied, the story she and Caleb had constructed flowing more smoothly now. "Though he's considering establishing more permanent connections in Colorado." "I see." Porter made a notation in his ledger, his pen scratching loudly in the quiet bank. "It seems fortunate indeed that his business brought him to Silver Creek just when you were facing such difficulties." "Providence," Emma agreed, meeting his gaze steadily. The banker nodded, though something in his expression suggested he placed more faith in human machinations than divine intervention. He finished counting, then rose to retrieve a document from a file cabinet behind his desk. "Everything appears to be in order, Mrs. Blackwood. This is your mortgage note, which I'm pleased to mark paid in full." He made a great show of stamping the document with red ink before presenting it to her with exaggerated courtesy. "The property is now yours, free and clear. Or, rather, your husband's, I should say." The reminder of her changed legal status, that the home she'd helped build, the land she'd worked alongside William, now technically belonged to Caleb under the law, sent a chill through Emma despite the warm October day. "Thank you, Mr. Porter," she said, carefully folding the document and tucking it into her reticule. "Is there anything else required?" "Not at all." Porter smiled, his manner considerably warmer now that she was no longer a delinquent debtor. "Though I would welcome an opportunity to meet Mr. Blackwood when he's recovered. The bank is always interested in establishing relationships with successful businessmen new to our community." "I'm sure he'd be delighted," Emma lied, imagining Caleb Blackwood sitting down with the town's leading citizens to discuss investment opportunities. The mental image was so absurd she nearly laughed aloud. Porter escorted her to the door with newfound deference, his curious gaze lingering on her retreating form as she descended the bank steps. One hurdle cleared, Emma thought with cautious relief, but as she turned toward the wagon where she'd left her purchases, a familiar figure standing beside it drove the momentary satisfaction from her heart. Sheriff Tate Taylor leaned against her wagon wheel, thumbs hooked in his belt loops, hat tipped back to reveal a face weathered by years of frontier justice. His expression as she approached was neutral, but Emma knew him well enough to recognize the professional assessment in his steady gaze. "Morning, Mrs. Blackwood," he greeted her, touching the brim of his hat. "Quite a change of name to get used to." "Good morning, Sheriff." Emma nodded cordially, attempting to move past him to place her bank documents in the wagon. Taylor didn't budge. "Heard about your nuptials yesterday. Reverend Matthews seemed a mite surprised by the hasty proceedings." "The Reverend is entitled to his opinions," Emma replied, her tone cooling slightly. Can't argue with that. Taylor shifted his weight, still effectively blocking her path to the wagon. Folks are saying your new husband's a cattle buyer. Don't believe I've made his acquaintance. Caleb is recovering from a riding accident at the Murphy homestead, Emma explained for what felt like the 100th time that morning. He'll be well enough to travel to town in another week or so. Murphy place? Taylor scratched his chin thoughtfully. Funny thing, that. Rode past there just yesterday morning. Didn't see any sign of visitors. Emma's heart lurched, but she maintained her composure. He's staying in their line shack, not the main house. Dr. Jenkins advised quiet and limited movement until the swelling in his shoulder subsides. His shoulder, you say? Taylor's gaze sharpened perceptibly. Hurt his shoulder in this fall, did he? Yes. Emma's mouth went dry as she realized her mistake. His right shoulder. He landed badly when the horse threw him. Taylor nodded slowly, though something in his expression suggested he was filing this information away for future reference. Seems you've had quite a run of coincidences lately, Mrs. Blackwood. Your window gets shot out during the raid, you suddenly remarry a man with an injured shoulder, and now, he glanced toward the bank, it appears your financial troubles have miraculously resolved themselves. The Lord works in mysterious ways, Emma replied, falling back on the same platitude that had silenced Mrs. Miller. Unlike the storekeeper's wife, however, Taylor wasn't so easily diverted. That he does, though in my experience, so do men with less divine intentions. He straightened, finally stepping aside to allow her access to the wagon. Just a friendly word of caution, Emma. Be careful who you invite into your home. Dangerous men can wear respectable faces when it suits them. I appreciate your concern, Sheriff, Emma said stiffly, but I assure you, my husband is exactly who he claims to be. At least in this, she wasn't lying. Caleb Blackwood had never pretended to be anything other than what he was. Outlaw, thief, a man operating beyond the bounds of conventional law. It was their presentation to the world that constituted the deception. For your sake and those children's, I hope that's true. Taylor touched his hat again in a gesture that somehow managed to convey both courtesy and warning. Good day, Mrs. Blackwood. Emma watched him stride away down the boardwalk, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sheriff suspected something. Whether he'd connected Caleb to the raid or simply found their sudden marriage suspicious, she couldn't be certain. But Taylor wasn't a man to let puzzling circumstances lie unexamined for long. With trembling hands, she loaded her purchases into the wagon, acutely aware of the curious glances from passers-by. News of her confrontation with the sheriff would doubtless provide fresh fodder for the town's gossips before nightfall. Emma climbed onto the wagon seat and took up the reins, eager to escape the suffocating scrutiny of Silver Creek. Only as the buildings fell away behind her and the open road stretched before her did she allow herself to release the breath she'd been holding. The mortgage was paid. The house was safe. Whatever price her reputation might pay for this hasty marriage, at least her children's home was secure. She urged the horse to a faster trot, suddenly desperate to return to the relative sanctuary of her homestead and to warn Caleb about the sheriff's suspicions. The sight that greeted Emma upon her return home stopped her in the doorway, packages clutched forgotten in her arms. Caleb sat at her kitchen table, William's old revolver disassembled before him on a clean cloth. Beside him, James leaned forward on his chair, rapt attention fixed on Caleb's hands as they moved with practiced precision over the weapon's components. Her son's face held an expression Emma hadn't seen in months. Boyish wonder, unmarred by the weight of premature responsibility. Now, a revolver's like any tool, Caleb was saying, his deep voice pitched to the serious tone men use when imparting important knowledge to boys on the cusp of manhood. Neglect it, and it'll fail you when you need it most. Treat it with respect, maintain it properly, and it'll serve you faithfully. James nodded solemnly. Pa always said a gun's not a toy. Your father was right. Caleb dipped a small brush in oil, demonstrating how to clean the barrel. A weapon carries responsibility with it, the power to protect but also to harm. A man needs to understand that weight before he picks one up. Did you learn when you were my age? James asked. Younger, actually. A shadow crossed Caleb's face. My father believed a boy should know how to use a firearm as soon as he could lift one safely. I was 6 when he taught me to shoot. I'm 8, James said proudly. Almost 9. Ma won't let me shoot yet, though. Your mother's a wise woman, Caleb replied. There's no rush. Better to learn proper handling first. Safety, cleaning, storage, all that comes before your finger ever touches a trigger. Emma must have made some small sound, for both males turned toward her simultaneously. James's expression instantly transformed from eager student to guilty child, while Caleb's remained calmly unapologetic. Ma! James scrambled to his feet. I was just watching. I swear, I didn't touch the gun. It's all right, James, Emma said, finding her voice as she set her packages on the counter. I can see you were learning about proper care, not playing. Relief washed over her son's face, followed swiftly by confusion at her unexpected acceptance. You're not mad? No, Emma assured him, though her emotions were considerably more complicated than her response suggested. Why don't you go check on Sarah? I think she's in the garden gathering the last of the carrots. James hesitated, glancing between his mother and his new stepfather, as if trying to gauge whether a storm might erupt in his absence. Finding no obvious signs of impending conflict, he nodded. Yes, ma'am. When the door closed behind him, Emma turned to Caleb, who had begun reassembling the revolver with efficient movements. You didn't think to ask my permission before including my son in firearms instruction? No, Caleb admitted, his hands never pausing in their work. I found him in here staring at his father's gun cabinet. It seemed better to demystify the object of fascination than let curiosity fester into experimentation. The practical wisdom of this approach diffused some of Emma's instinctive anger. I would still prefer to be consulted on matters concerning my children's education. Noted. Caleb clicked the cylinder back into place. Though I recall our agreement specified appropriate friendliness and not undermining your authority, I fulfilled both conditions. Emma sighed, removing her bonnet and hanging it on the peg by the door. Now that her initial shock had passed, she could acknowledge the value in James learning proper firearm safety from an experienced adult, even if that adult happened to be an outlaw notorious for his skill with a gun. The window's fixed, she observed, noticing for the first time the neatly repaired pane that had been shattered during the raid. And the barn door? Reinforced with new hinges and a stronger latch, Caleb confirmed, setting the now assembled revolver aside. The woodpile's been restocked as well. You were running low. Emma stared at him, momentarily speechless. She'd been gone barely 3 hours, yet he'd managed to complete repairs that had been on her list for weeks. Despite his healing wound and his status as a guest, albeit one with legal rights to her home, he'd taken it upon himself to address practical needs without being asked. You shouldn't overexert yourself, she said finally, the only response she could formulate that didn't involve either excessive gratitude or confused suspicion. Your shoulder is healing well thanks to your ministrations. Caleb rose from the table, moving with the careful precision of a man cognizant of his injury, but determined not to be limited by it. I've endured worse and worked through it. Emma busied herself unpacking her purchases, unsettled by this display of domestic consideration from a man she'd expected to approach their arrangement with far more self-interest. I paid off the mortgage, she informed him, changing the subject. The house is secure. Good. Caleb leaned against the counter, watching her with those unnervingly perceptive blue eyes. How did Porter take your sudden financial resurrection? With surprise and suspicion, like everyone else in town. Emma stacked the flour and coffee on the shelf. The sheriff was waiting when I left the bank. He's asking questions about my new husband's convenient appearance and injured shoulder. Caleb absorbed this news with neither surprise nor apparent concern. Taylor's a good lawman. I'd have been disappointed if he hadn't made the connection. That's hardly comforting, Emma retorted. If he discovers who you really are, he won't. Caleb interrupted with quiet confidence. Not if we maintain our story consistently. I've evaded more determined pursuit than one small-town sheriff. Before Emma could respond to this less than reassuring assertion, the back door burst open and Sarah tumbled in, her apron bulging with misshapen carrots and her face smudged with garden dirt. Look what I found, she announced, dumping her harvest onto the counter without ceremony. The biggest carrot in the whole world. She thrust a particularly gnarled specimen toward Caleb, who accepted it with appropriate solemnity. That's impressive indeed, he agreed, turning the vegetable to examine it from all angles. though it looks less like a carrot and more like a sea monster, Sarah supplied eagerly, with 3 heads and a tail. Exactly what I was thinking, Caleb said, his serious tone belied by the smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. Clearly not a normal carrot at all, but a rare garden creature discovered by the intrepid explorer Sarah Thornton. Sarah giggled, her initial shyness around their house guest apparently forgotten. Can we put him in the stew pot and eat him for dinner? A fitting end for such a magnificent beast, Caleb agreed. Though perhaps we should name him first. It seems impolite to eat an unnamed sea monster. Reginald, Sarah decided instantly. That's a good name for a carrot monster. Reginald the carrot monster it is. Caleb handed the vegetable back to her with a small bow. I'm honored to make his acquaintance before his tragic but delicious fate. Emma watched this exchange with a strange tightness in her chest. Caleb's easy manner with Sarah, the genuine warmth in his interaction with her imaginative daughter, contrasted sharply with everything she'd expected from the notorious outlaw. The man who had robbed banks and trains, who had reportedly shot guards without hesitation, was naming misshapen carrots and teaching her son responsibility rather than recklessness. It was profoundly unsettling. Sarah, please wash those carrots properly, Emma instructed, needing to reassert some semblance of normal routine. And then wash your hands and face. You look like you've been digging to China. I was looking for treasure, Sarah explained earnestly. James said sometimes people bury gold in gardens. Emma shot an alarmed glance at Caleb, who raised an eyebrow in silent amusement at her discomfort. Your brother was teasing you, she told Sarah firmly. People keep gold in banks, not gardens. Some people do, Caleb murmured, just loudly enough for Emma to hear. She ignored this unhelpful commentary. Wash up now, please. We'll start dinner soon. When Sarah had complied and moved to the wash basin, Emma turned back to Caleb. You've been busy today, she observed quietly. Idle hands and all that, he replied with a shrug that he immediately seemed to regret as pain flickered across his features. Besides, practical improvements seemed the best way to demonstrate my usefulness to this household. Emma studied him, trying to reconcile this considerate, industrious man with the dangerous outlaw she had discovered in her barn. The children seem to have taken to you quickly. Children are generally good judges of character, Caleb said. They respond to honesty even when the adults around them are maintaining necessary fictions. The observation struck uncomfortably close to Emma's own misgivings about the web of deception they were weaving. And what honest assessment do you imagine they've made of you, Mr. Blackwood? That I mean them no harm, he answered simply. That I respect their mother. That I can perhaps fill certain gaps left by their father's absence, without attempting to replace him. Children don't require elaborate explanations, just consistent behavior and clear boundaries. Again, that unsettling insight that suggested experience rather than mere observation. Emma found herself wondering, not for the first time, what path had led Caleb Blackwood from whatever respectable life he'd once had to the notoriety he now carried. Before she could pursue this line of thought, James reappeared, his expression guarded as he assessed the atmosphere between the adults. Finding no obvious tension, he relaxed slightly. I fed the chickens and collected the eggs, he reported. 6 today. Thank you, Jamie. Emma smiled at her son, touched as always by his eagerness to contribute to the household's welfare. That was very helpful. Mr. Blackwood said tomorrow he might show me how to mend the chicken coop where the fox got in last month, James added tentatively, glancing at Caleb for confirmation. If your mother approves, Caleb said, deferring to Emma with a respect that seemed genuine rather than performative. Emma felt both their gazes on her, James hopeful, Caleb watchful. She recognized the significance of the moment. Her response would establish the parameters of Caleb's role in their household going forward. That sounds like an excellent plan, she agreed, rewarded by the brightening of her son's expression. The co-op has needed proper repairs for some time. The remainder of the afternoon unfolded with a surprising harmony, as if the new configuration of their household had somehow been in place for months rather than hours. Emma prepared dinner while Caleb sat at the table mending James's torn school jacket with neat stitches that spoke of practical experience rather than any masculine discomfort with traditionally feminine tasks. Sarah arranged her sea monster carrots in fanciful patterns, providing a running commentary on their imagined adventures before consumption. It was all so unexpectedly normal, as if Caleb Blackwood belonged in this kitchen, in this family, his presence filling the empty space William's death had left without erasing the memory of the man who had come before. The realization both comforted and alarmed Emma. Their arrangement was temporary, practical, a business transaction, not a true marriage. Allowing herself or the children to grow accustomed to Caleb's presence would only make his eventual departure more painful. Yet she couldn't deny the lightening she felt in her own spirit, watching James engaged in male pursuits again, seeing Sarah's imagination encouraged rather than merely tolerated. For the first time in 2 years, she wasn't solely responsible for every aspect of their lives, a burden she hadn't fully acknowledged until someone else helped shoulder it. After dinner, when the children had been tucked into bed with stories promised for the morning, Emma and Caleb once again found themselves alone at the kitchen table. An awkward silence fell between them, laden with the unspoken complexities of their situation. "I should check your wound," Emma said finally, rising to gather fresh bandages, "to ensure your exertions today haven't caused any damage." Caleb submitted to her ministrations without protest, unbuttoning his shirt with his good hand to expose the healing injury. Emma worked efficiently, her touch clinical despite her heightened awareness of his proximity. The wound looked remarkably improved, a testament to both her nursing skills and his apparently robust constitution. "Another few days and you'll scarcely need bandaging," she observed, securing a fresh dressing in place. "Your talents are wasted on outlaws," Caleb replied, a hint of humor warming his voice. "You'd have made an excellent physician." "Women aren't physicians," Emma reminded him, though the compliment pleased her more than it should have. "Then the medical profession's loss is Silver Creek's gain." Caleb rebuttoned his shirt as Emma packed away her supplies. "I've been thinking about sleeping arrangements." Emma stiffened, instantly alert. Their agreement had specified a marriage in name only, but perhaps he'd reconsidered, now that the legalities were completed and the gold delivered as promised. "I believe the sofa in the barn would be more appropriate," Caleb continued, apparently oblivious to her sudden tension. "With proper bedding, it would be comfortable enough and it would give you and the children more privacy in the house." Emma stared at him, momentarily speechless. Far from demanding his husbandly rights, he was suggesting removing himself entirely from the household. "The barn? But why would you—" "I didn't marry you for your house, Emma," he said quietly, his perceptive gaze reading her confusion. "I married you to give you protection when you needed it most. That protection doesn't require my physical presence under your roof, especially when it might cause you discomfort." The simple statement, delivered without expectation of gratitude or acknowledgement, unsettled Emma more profoundly than any assertion of marital rights could have. This considerate assessment of her comfort, this willingness to accommodate her unspoken concerns, didn't align with anything she'd expected from Caleb Blackwood. "The temperature's dropping at night," she found herself saying. "The barn isn't properly insulated." "I've slept in considerably less comfortable circumstances," Caleb assured her with a slight smile. "A Colorado barn in autumn is practically luxurious compared to some places I've laid my head." Emma should have accepted his offer without argument. It would certainly simplify their domestic arrangement, removing the constant awkwardness of sharing living quarters with a man who was her husband legally but not in truth. Yet something, perhaps simple human kindness, perhaps something more complicated, made her hesitate. "The sofa here is perfectly adequate for now," she said finally, "at least until your shoulder is fully healed. The barn would be... Caleb studied her face, as if trying to determine whether her offer stemmed from obligation or genuine preference. "If you're certain," he said cautiously. "I am." Emma began clearing the table, needing physical activity to distract from the strange emotional undertow of their conversation. "Though I appreciate the consideration behind your offer." Caleb rose to help her, gathering dishes with his good arm. They worked in companionable silence for several minutes, establishing an unexpectedly comfortable rhythm of cooperation. "The sheriff will be watching the house," Emma said eventually, returning to their earlier conversation. "If he discovers you're not actually staying at the Murphy place, we'll need to adjust our story," Caleb acknowledged. "Perhaps my recovery has proceeded more rapidly than expected, allowing me to join my new family sooner than anticipated." Emma nodded, relieved by his practical approach to the potential complication. "That could work, though it means you'll need to appear in town sooner as well." "I'll be ready." Caleb set the last plate in the wash basin. "My shoulder is healing well enough for a brief public appearance. We can ride in together next Sunday for church services, establish our presence as a respectable married couple." The thought of presenting themselves before the entire community as newlyweds made Emma's stomach tighten with apprehension. The brief interactions in town today had been uncomfortable enough. A formal church appearance would invite even more scrutiny. Yet it was necessary, she knew. Their deception required commitment to be convincing, particularly with the sheriff's suspicions already aroused. "Very well," she agreed reluctantly. "Sunday services it is." Caleb reached across the table, his hand covering hers briefly, in a gesture that seemed designed to offer reassurance. "You've faced worse challenges than town gossip, Emma Blackwood. This, too, shall pass." The use of her new name, his name, sent a disconcerting shiver through her. Yet as she met his steady gaze across the kitchen table, Emma found herself drawing unexpected strength from his confidence. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps this strange alliance, this unholy matrimony entered into for the most practical of reasons, might yet see them both through the dangers that threatened. For the first time since discovering the wounded outlaw in her barn, Emma allowed herself to consider the possibility that Caleb Blackwood's arrival in her life, regardless of the circumstances, might prove providential after all. The autumn sun cast long shadows across Emma's yard as she pinned the last of the washing to the line. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine from the surrounding hills, the afternoon peaceful save for the distant chatter of the children playing by the creek. James had taken Sarah to catch tadpoles in the shallows, a rare indulgence Emma had granted after they'd finished their chores with unusual efficiency. Their eager industry hadn't escaped her notice. Both children seemed determined to impress their new stepfather, Sarah with her careful arrangement of the breakfast dishes, James with his diligent attention to the firewood and animal care. Though only 2 days had passed since the hasty wedding ceremony, Caleb's presence had already begun reshaping their small household in ways Emma found both reassuring and unsettling. She reached for another bedsheet, shaking it briskly before draping it over the line. From inside the house came the steady rhythm of Caleb's hammer as he replaced the loose floorboard in the kitchen, a repair Emma had postponed for months, lacking both time and expertise. The domestic sound struck her with unexpected poignancy. How long had it been since a man's work had filled her home? Since she'd shared the endless burden of maintenance and care with another adult? The distant rumble of an approaching carriage pulled Emma from her thoughts. Visitors were rare at the Thornton homestead, that is, the Blackwood homestead now, she corrected herself with a small shock of disorientation. The road passing their property led only to the Murphy place beyond, and the Murphys generally traveled by wagon rather than the fine carriage now coming into view. Emma's hands stilled on the laundry as recognition dawned. The elegant conveyance with its matched bay geldings could only belong to the Silver Creek Hotel's stable, which meant its occupants were almost certainly the Harringtons. Her suspicion was confirmed as the carriage drew closer, revealing Edward Harrington's silvered head beside his lawyer's bowler hat. "Caleb," she called, keeping her voice measured despite the sudden acceleration of her pulse. "We have visitors! It's the Harringtons!" The hammering inside ceased immediately. Through the open window, Emma glimpsed Caleb's swift, economical movement as he rose from his work, retrieving something from the shelf near the door. His revolver, she realized with a cold certainty, the same weapon he'd been cleaning with James the previous day. "Stay on the porch," he instructed quietly. the calm authority in his voice brooking no argument. "Will remain inside unless needed." Emma nodded, untying her apron with hands that betrayed only the slightest tremor. She smoothed her hair, suddenly conscious of her plain work dress and the smudge of soap that likely marked her cheek. Not that she cared for the Harringtons' good opinion, but ingrained social habits died hard. By the time the carriage halted before her gate, Emma had positioned herself strategically on the porch steps, her posture straight, chin lifted in an attitude of polite inquiry rather than welcome. The children remained out of sight down by the creek, a small mercy for which she offered silent thanks. Edward Harrington descended first, his elegant attire absurdly out of place against the rustic backdrop of her homestead. The lawyer, Garrett, followed, brushing invisible dust from his sleeves with fastidious movements. Neither man initially noticed Caleb's absence, their attention fixed on Emma with unsettling intensity. "Mrs. Thornton," Edward called as he approached, deliberately using her former name. "I hope we find you well this fine afternoon." "Mrs. Blackwood," Emma corrected firmly. "And yes, thank you, I'm quite well." She made no move to descend the steps or invite them inside, her greeting carrying just enough civility to avoid outright rudeness. "This is an unexpected visit." Edward reached the bottom step, looking up at her with the condescending smile she'd come to loathe. "We were concerned when you missed our appointment at the hotel yesterday. Then to hear of your hasty nuptials." He shook his head with exaggerated concern. "Well, naturally, we felt compelled to call upon you directly." "How thoughtful," Emma replied, her tone suggesting it was anything but. "However, as you can see, I'm rather occupied with household matters at present." "Yes, domestic duties." Edward glanced dismissively at the laundry fluttering on the line. "Such concerns would be unnecessary if you'd accepted our generous offer. In Boston, servants would manage such tiresome tasks. I find honest work far from tiresome, Mr. Harrington." Garrett cleared his throat, stepping forward with the air of a man accustomed to smoothing ruffled feathers. "What Mr. Harrington means to convey, Mrs. Blackwood, is our genuine concern for your welfare. This sudden marriage seems rather impulsive, particularly given your vulnerable state as a widow with young children." Emma's spine stiffened. "I assure you, Mr. Garrett, neither my judgment nor my faculties are impaired by widowhood. My marriage was a carefully considered decision." Of course," Edward interjected with a dismissive wave, though one wonders what William would think of his widow remarrying so hastily, to a cattle buyer, no less. The contempt in the final words was unmistakable. "My late husband valued character above occupation or pedigree," Emma responded, her composure fraying slightly at the invocation of William's name. "A philosophy that served him well when choosing his own wife, if not his blood relations." The barb found its mark. Edward's affable mask slipped, revealing the harder man beneath. William was young and idealistic. He failed to consider the practical implications of his choices. A failure you seem determined to perpetuate. Have you considered what example this sets for your children? A mother who remarries with unseemly haste, binding herself to a stranger without proper consideration of their background or character? I've found that children learn more from honest affection and integrity than from adherence to arbitrary social conventions, Emma replied, though the accusation struck painfully close to her own private doubts. "Admirable sentiments," Gareth said smoothly, "though sentiment won't secure their future. Our offer remains open, Mrs. Blackwood. The family is prepared to provide generous financial compensation if you'll reconsider relocating east with the children." "Compensation?" Emma repeated, her voice sharpening. "You make it sound as if you're purchasing them." Edward stepped onto the first porch step, his expression hardening. "Be reasonable, Emma. This arrangement you've entered into won't withstand scrutiny. A respectable widow suddenly marrying an itinerant cattle buyer with no connections in the community? People will talk. Questions will arise, for the children's sake, if not your own." "My wife has already declined your offer," a deep voice interrupted from the doorway. "I suggest you respect her decision." Caleb stood framed in the entrance, his broad shoulders nearly filling the space. Though his stance appeared casual, one arm draped across the doorframe while the other remained hidden from view, the coiled readiness in his posture conveyed unmistakable warning. His expression remained pleasant, almost cordial, yet something cold and dangerous lurked in his blue eyes, the outlaw visible beneath the cattle buyer's veneer. Edward froze mid-step, instinctively retreating to safer ground. "Mr. Blackwood, I presume. At your service." Caleb didn't move from the doorway, his relaxed posture belied by the predatory watchfulness of his gaze. "Though it seems my wife has the situation well in hand." "We were discussing family matters," Edward said stiffly. "Concerns regarding William's children." "My stepchildren," Caleb corrected, his voice mild but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Whose welfare is now my responsibility, along with their mothers." Garrett, ever the diplomat, intervened with practiced smoothness. "Naturally, Mr. Blackwood, we merely wish to ensure Mrs. Blackwood understood all her options before settling into her new circumstances." "My circumstances are quite settled, thank you," Emma said, finding her voice again. The unexpected surge of gratitude she felt toward Caleb for his timely intervention confused her almost as much as the Harringtons' visit. "And as my husband said, I've made my decision. I would appreciate if you'd respect it." Edward's gaze shifted between Emma and Caleb, calculation evident in his expression. Whatever he read in Caleb's steady stance apparently convinced him that pressing further would be unwise. "As you wish. Though, should you reconsider, our offer remains open for a limited time." "We won't be reconsidering," Caleb stated with such quiet certainty that even Emma found herself believing him. "Then we'll take our leave." Edward inclined his head with stiff formality. "Good day, Mrs. Blackwood." "Mr. Blackwood?" As the Harrington men retreated to their waiting carriage, Caleb finally moved from the doorway, coming to stand beside Emma on the porch. Together they watched in silence as the elegant conveyance turned in her yard, wheels crunching on the gravel before carrying the unwelcome visitors back toward town. Only when the carriage had disappeared from view did Emma release the breath she'd been holding. "Thank you," she said quietly, "though I had the situation under control." "You did," Caleb agreed, surprising her. "I merely hastened their departure." Emma glanced at him, noting the way his right hand now rested openly at his side, no weapon visible, though she was certain one remained within easy reach. "They'll be back," she said, "with a different approach." "Undoubtedly." Caleb's expression was thoughtful as he gazed down the empty road. "Men like that don't surrender easily when they want something." "They want William's documents," Emma said, voicing the certainty that had been growing since discovering the hidden map in the pocket watch. "Whatever evidence he gathered against them." "Yes." Caleb turned to her, his gaze direct. "And they'll use whatever leverage they can find, your reputation, your financial security, even the children, to obtain it." The matter-of-fact assessment chilled Emma despite the warm afternoon sun. "I won't let them near my children," she said firmly. "Nor will I." The simple declaration contained such conviction that Emma found herself believing him despite everything she knew about his outlaw past. A moment of silence stretched between them, not quite comfortable but no longer laden with the awkwardness of strangers. For the first time since their hasty wedding, Emma felt something akin to partnership with this man who was her husband in name only. "They seemed surprised to find you here," she observed. "Our story about you recuperating at the Murphy place apparently reached them." "Good." Caleb's mouth curved in a slight smile. "Let them waste time watching empty buildings, while I'm here protecting what matters." The casual inclusion of her family in "what matters" to Caleb Blackwood sent an unexpected warmth through Emma. Before she could examine the sensation too closely, a childish shout from the creek announced James and Sarah's return, their voices bright with excitement over their tadpole discoveries. As the children approached, Emma was struck by how naturally Caleb shifted his stance, the dangerous vigilance that had confronted the Harringtons dissolving into the relaxed posture of a man greeting family. The transformation was so seamless, so convincing, that for a moment even Emma found herself believing the fiction they'd created. "Found anything interesting?" Caleb called to the children, descending the porch steps to meet them. 7 tadpoles and a crawdad big as your thumb, James reported enthusiastically, holding up a jar of muddy water where tiny creatures darted about. And Sarah found a pretty rock shaped like a heart. It's for you, Sarah announced, presenting a smooth, pink-streaked stone to Caleb with solemn ceremony. Because you're part of our family now, Emma watched, her heart constricting painfully as Caleb accepted the humble gift with grave courtesy that matched Sarah's seriousness. Thank you, he said, tucking the stone into his pocket. I'll keep it safe. The simple exchange, the children's easy acceptance of this man into their lives, filled Emma with both gratitude and apprehension. For all their sakes, she hoped their trust wasn't misplaced. Yet as she observed Caleb crouching to examine James's tadpole collection, his expression one of genuine interest rather than feigned enthusiasm, she found herself wondering if perhaps this arrangement might offer more than mere practical protection. The thought disquieted her far more than the Harringtons' threats. The house settled into nighttime stillness, the familiar creaks and sighs of the wooden structure a soothing counterpoint to Emma's restless thoughts. Sleep eluded her despite the day's exertions, her mind turning over and over the confrontation with the Harringtons and what it portended. After an hour of futile pursuit of slumber, she rose and wrapped her shawl around her nightdress. Perhaps a cup of warmed milk might quiet her racing thoughts, though she doubted any simple remedy could address the complexity of her situation. The soft glow of lantern light spilling from the kitchen took her by surprise. Emma paused in the hallway, momentarily uncertain whether to proceed or retreat to her bedroom. The choice was removed when a floorboard creaked beneath her weight, announcing her presence. Couldn't sleep either? Caleb's voice carried quietly from the kitchen. Emma sighed, tightening her shawl around her shoulders before stepping into the kitchen doorway. No. Caleb sat at her table, a glass of amber liquid before him and William's battered copy of Ivanhoe open beside it. He'd removed his boots and collar, his dark hair falling across his forehead in a way that softened the harder planes of his face. The domesticity of the scene, a man reading by lamplight in her kitchen, struck Emma with unexpected poignancy. "The shoulder giving you trouble?" she asked, nodding toward the whiskey he was clearly using as medicine. "Some," he admitted, "though it's improving daily thanks to your care." Emma hesitated, propriety warring with practicality. She shouldn't be alone with a man, even her nominal husband, while dressed in her nightclothes, her hair loose around her shoulders. Yet retreating seemed both cowardly and absurd given their unusual circumstances. "I was going to make some warm milk," she said finally, moving toward the stove where embers still glowed. "Would you like some?" "Thank you, no." Caleb lifted his glass slightly. "I've found my remedy." Emma busied herself with the familiar routine of warming milk, grateful for the activity that allowed her to keep her back turned. The kitchen seemed smaller somehow with Caleb in it, though he made no move to approach her or breach the careful distance she'd maintained. "Scott's an interesting choice," she commented, nodding toward the novel as she stirred her milk. William enjoyed his work, though he preferred Rob Roy to Ivanhoe. A Scotsman at heart, then? Caleb closed the book, marking his place with a slip of paper. "I've always found Ivanhoe the more compelling tale. The returning warrior, the divided loyalties, the question of where true belonging lies." The observation, unexpectedly thoughtful, reminded Emma that this man was far more than the simple outlaw she'd initially judged him to be. "You read widely," she noted, pouring her warmed milk into a cup. "When circumstances permit." Something like self-deprecation crossed his features. "My current profession doesn't allow much leisure for literary pursuits." Emma hesitated, then made a decision that surprised even herself. She brought her cup to the table and sat across from him, maintaining propriety's minimum requirements while acknowledging the absurdity of standing stiffly across the room from a man who was, legally at least, her husband. "Your current profession," she repeated. "You speak as if it were a temporary occupation rather than a chosen path." Caleb's expression turned reflective, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. "Few men set out to become outlaws, Emma. Most of us stumble into it through a series of decisions that seem reasonable at the time, only to find ourselves unable to find the path back." "What was your path?" she asked, the quiet intimacy of the midnight hour allowing questions that would have seemed impertinent in daylight. "Before." Caleb was silent for so long Emma thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the distance of a man looking back across years rather than miles. "I fought for the Union," he said simply. "3rd Colorado Cavalry." Emma's cup paused halfway to her lips. "William's regiment. Yes, though our paths never crossed during the war. I was a scout, usually detached from the main force." A shadow crossed his face. "After Appomattox, I returned home to find my family's ranch in Wyoming had been seized for taxes while I was away fighting. The new owner, a Harrington Mining Company representative who never served a day, informed me that my parents had died within weeks of each other the previous winter." "I'm sorry," Emma said, the inadequate words all she could offer against such loss. Caleb acknowledged her sympathy with a slight nod. "The war changed many of us. Men who'd seen what we'd seen, done what we'd done. Civilian life felt like someone else's ill-fitting clothes." The confession resonated with Emma's own experiences of displacement, though hers had come through widowhood rather than war. "William struggled after he returned," she said softly. "Nightmares. Days when even familiar sounds, a door slamming, a kettle whistling, would startle him like gunfire." "The war stays with you," Caleb agreed. "Though some men hide it better than others." Emma studied him across the table. This man who had fought for the same cause as her William, yet had emerged on such a different path. "It doesn't explain how you became—" She hesitated, uncertain how to delicately phrase the transition from soldier to criminal. "An outlaw?" Caleb supplied with a hint of grim humor. "The journey from respected veteran to wanted man is shorter than most realize. For me, it began with attempting to reclaim my family's property through legal channels. When that failed, when I discovered how thoroughly the Harringtons had corrupted local officials, I chose less conventional methods." "Robbery," Emma said, not accusingly but seeking clarity. "Justice," Caleb corrected. "Though I won't deny there's a certain satisfaction in taking from those who've taken so much from others." He lifted his glass, studying the amber liquid against the lamplight. "And, admittedly, there's a freedom in operating outside society's constraints that becomes habit-forming." The admission carried a frankness that Emma hadn't expected. "Do you regret it, the path you've chosen?" Caleb considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I regret the necessity, not the choice itself. Though there are moments, sitting in a decent kitchen, sharing conversation with an intelligent woman, when I glimpse what a different life might have offered." The quiet confession created an unexpected intimacy between them, a momentary bridging of the careful distance they'd maintained. Emma found herself responding in kind, sharing truths she'd kept guarded even from close friends in town. "I met William when I was teaching school in Pennsylvania," she said, warming her hands around her cup. "He'd come east to settle his mother's affairs after her death. She'd been estranged from the Harringtons for years. They'd disowned her for marrying beneath her station. But she'd maintained her family connections in our town." "And he courted the local schoolteacher?" Caleb prompted when she fell silent. "Against his family's wishes, I imagine." "They wanted him to marry the daughter of a Boston shipping magnate," Emma confirmed. "A business arrangement disguised as matrimony. When William chose me instead, his father threatened to disinherit him." "So he changed his name and came west," Caleb concluded. "Trading wealth for freedom." "Yes." Emma smiled softly at the memory. He said the name Thornton carried more honor in its humble history than Harrington with all its prestige. His mother would have agreed. They lapsed into companionable silence, each absorbed in private recollections. Emma found herself strangely comfortable sharing these memories with Caleb, as if his outsider status somehow made him a safer confidant than those who had known William. "I worry sometimes," she admitted after a while, the confession emerging unbidden in the midnight quiet, "that I'm failing them, James and Sarah. That without William's guidance, they'll grow up lacking something essential." "Children are remarkably resilient," Caleb observed, "and they have you, a mother who would face down wealthy Eastern magnates and forge alliances with outlaws to protect them. I'd say they're fortunate indeed." Emma glanced up, surprised by both the assessment and the gentle humor underlying it. An unusual definition of fortune. Perhaps, Caleb acknowledged. But character is formed through adversity as much as advantage. Your children are learning courage, determination, and integrity from your example. Those qualities serve better in life's hardest moments than any amount of wealth or privilege. The insight, offered without condescension or platitude, touched Emma unexpectedly. How long had it been since someone had offered reassurance about her parenting, acknowledged the constant worry that shadowed her every decision since William's death? "Thank you," she said simply. Caleb reached for the whiskey bottle to refill his glass, his hand inadvertently brushing against hers where it rested on the table. The brief contact sent a surprising warmth up Emma's arm, a physical awareness she hadn't experienced since William's death. Neither pulled away immediately, the momentary connection lingering like the last note of a familiar melody. Emma was the first to break the spell, standing abruptly and gathering her empty cup. "It's late," she said, her voice not quite steady. "We should both try to sleep." "Of course." Caleb remained seated, though his gaze followed her movement across the kitchen. "Thank you for the company, Emma. It's been too long since I've enjoyed civilized conversation at midnight." Something in his tone, a hint of genuine regret for the life his choices had cost him, touched Emma despite her determination to maintain emotional distance. This man was dangerous not merely because of his outlaw status, she realized, but because of his unexpected capacity for understanding and his disarming honesty about his flawed path. "This doesn't change anything," she felt compelled to state, as much to herself as to him. Their arrangement remained one of convenience and necessity, not genuine marital connection. Caleb's smile held a mixture of amusement and something deeper, more wistful. "Everything changes, Emma," he said quietly, "whether we want it to or not." The simple truth in his words followed Emma back to her bedroom, where sleep continued to elude her, though for entirely different reasons than before. Chapter 6: Dangerous Ground. Sunday morning had brought a successful, if uncomfortable, first appearance at church as husband and wife. Emma still felt the weight of the congregation's stares as she entered the Silver Creek post office the following morning. Each pair of eyes had assessed them, some with curiosity, others with blatant disapproval, a few with the gleeful interest of those who thrived on others' misfortunes. Caleb had weathered the scrutiny with remarkable composure, his demeanor that of a respectable businessman rather than the notorious outlaw she knew him to be. He'd greeted the minister with proper deference, nodded cordially to the menfolk, and maintained a protective yet proper distance from Emma throughout the service. Only the careful way he held his injured shoulder and the watchful alertness in his eyes, never quite relaxing despite his pleasant expression, betrayed anything unusual about the handsome cattleman. Now, as Emma pushed open the post office door, she wondered what fresh gossip might have sprouted overnight from their public debut. Hiram Tucker, the elderly postmaster who'd held the position since Silver Creek's founding, glanced up from sorting letters with undisguised interest. "Well now, if it isn't Mrs. Blackwood," he greeted her, emphasizing her new name with barely concealed avidity. "Come for your mail, have you?" "Good morning, Mr. Tucker," Emma replied, keeping her tone pleasantly neutral. "Yes, please." Tucker shuffled through a stack of letters with deliberate slowness, clearly hoping to extend the interaction. "That was quite the surprise you gave us all yesterday. Your new husband seems a fine figure of a man." "Thank you," Emma murmured, unwilling to provide further fodder for the town's rumor mill. "I believe we have some mail?" "Indeed you do." Tucker finally produced 2 envelopes from beneath the counter. "This one came addressed to the homestead yesterday, but young Jenkins, who was delivering, said nobody answered his knock. Thought I'd better hold it for you." "Most considerate," Emma said, accepting the envelopes. The first was a simple letter from her cousin in Denver, likely a response to the news of her remarriage, which Emma had hastily penned the day after the ceremony. The second, however, made her blood run cold. Heavy cream-colored stationery, expensive and formal, bore the embossed seal of Harrington Mining Company in its upper corner. Emma's name, Mrs. Emma Blackwood, formerly Thornton, was written in an elegant copperplate hand that fairly shouted Eastern refinement. "Important business, is it?" Tucker inquired, making no attempt to disguise his curiosity as he noted her reaction. That's mighty fine paper for these parts. Just a correspondence, Emma replied vaguely, tucking both envelopes into her reticule. Thank you, Mr. Tucker. 2 letters came, you know, the postmaster continued, unwilling to relinquish her attention so easily. Just like that one, delivered to your house yesterday, though I expect you know that already. Emma paused, her hand on the doorknob. I'm sorry? The messenger, Tucker explained, clearly delighted to be providing information she didn't have, rode out special from the hotel with instructions to deliver directly to your homestead, fine-dressed fellow, Eastern manners, said he had a letter of great importance to deliver to Mrs. Blackwood. He leaned forward conspiratorially. One of them Harrington men, I believe. I see, Emma said, her mind racing. Thank you for telling me. Peculiar, ain't it? Tucker mused. 2 identical letters, one delivered special, one through regular post. Almost like someone wasn't certain you'd receive the first. Indeed, Emma murmured, suddenly eager to escape the postmaster's probing gaze. Good day, Mr. Tucker. The bright October sunshine outside did nothing to dispel the chill that had settled between Emma's shoulder blades. A letter delivered to her home yesterday when she and Caleb had attended church services together, the children in tow. A letter Caleb had apparently failed to mention upon their return. She untied her mare from the hitching post with quick, efficient movements, her thoughts churning with growing suspicion. Why would Caleb withhold the Harringtons' correspondence? What connection might exist between the notorious outlaw and the powerful Eastern family? The timing seemed too convenient. His appearance coinciding with their renewed interest in her family, his wound happening just as the Harrington men arrived in Silver Creek. Emma mounted her horse, urging it toward home at a pace just short of reckless. The official envelope seemed to burn against her side where it rested in her reticule, its contents as yet unknown but already sending tendrils of doubt through her carefully constructed certainties. By the time the homestead came into view, Emma had worked herself into a state of grim determination. She would have answers, even if they confirmed her worst fears about the man she had legally bound herself to. The yard stood quiet in the late morning sun. James and Sarah were at school, the house stillness broken only by the rhythmic sound of an axe striking wood. Emma rounded the corner to find Caleb at the chopping block, his shirt discarded in the autumn warmth, sweat gleaming on his shoulders as he split logs for the winter woodpile. She reined in her horse, momentarily arrested by the unexpected domesticity of the scene. Caleb Blackwood, outlaw, bank robber, possibly conspirator with her enemies, was steadily building up her winter wood supply despite his healing wound. The pile beside him had grown impressively since she'd left for town, evidence of at least an hour's labor. As if sensing her presence, Caleb paused mid-swing and turned. "Emma," he greeted her, lowering the axe and reaching for the shirt draped over a nearby stump. "You're back sooner than I expected." "Evidently," she replied, dismounting with less than her usual grace. "Your shoulder appears much improved." Caleb shrugged, a slight wince betraying that the movement wasn't entirely painless. Exercise strengthens healing muscles. He pulled the shirt over his head, seeming to sense her discomfort with his state of undress. And the woodpile needed attention before the first snow. The mundane explanation, the simple practicality of his labor momentarily disarmed Emma. How many times in the past 2 years had she worried about having enough wood to see them through winter? How many nights had she lain awake calculating whether her meager strength and James's boyish efforts would be sufficient to the task? She pushed the gratitude aside, hardening her resolve. "We received a letter today," she said, withdrawing the envelope from her reticule and holding it up. "From the Harringtons." If she'd expected a guilty start or evasive glance, she was disappointed. Caleb merely nodded, wiping his hands on his trousers. "What does it say?" "I haven't opened it yet." Emma studied his face, searching for signs of deception. "Apparently a similar letter was delivered here yesterday while we were at church." "Was it?" Caleb's expression remained frustratingly neutral. "I found no correspondence when we returned." Mr. Tucker was quite certain. A special messenger rode out from town with explicit instructions to deliver directly to our homestead. Emma took a step closer, her suspicion crystallizing into direct accusation. "Did you receive a letter yesterday, Caleb?" His blue eyes met hers steadily. I did not. Either he was telling the truth, or he was a more accomplished liar than she'd given him credit for. Emma broke the seal on the envelope, unfolding the heavy paper without taking her eyes from his face. It's an invitation, she said after scanning the elegant script, to attend a gathering at the Harrington estate in Colorado Springs. They've specifically requested the children's presence. When? Caleb asked, setting aside the axe and moving toward her. Next Saturday. Emma handed him the letter, watching carefully as he read it. They mention looking forward to meeting my new husband and becoming better acquainted with his business interests. Caleb's eyebrows rose slightly as he read that particular line. Subtle, he commented dryly. They're fishing for information, or extending an invitation to an existing acquaintance, Emma countered, unable to keep the edge from her voice. Tell me, Caleb, do you have connections to the Harringtons that you haven't shared? His head snapped up, genuine surprise crossing his features. You think I'm working with them? Against you? The incredulity in his tone seemed authentic, but Emma pressed on, needing certainty. I think it's a remarkable coincidence that you appeared in my barn with a bullet wound just as the Harringtons arrived in town, that you proposed marriage as a solution to my problems just as they were pressing me to return east, that you seem to know a great deal about their business practices for a man who claims no prior connection to them. Not for a man who spent 2 years targeting their interests, Caleb replied, his voice hardening. I've told you, Emma. The Harringtons destroyed my family's ranch, just as they arranged your husband's accident. I have no alliance with them, now or ever. Then why were you so quick to offer marriage? Emma demanded, the question that had troubled her since his proposal finally finding voice. You could have simply taken your gold and disappeared once your wound healed. Why entangle yourself with me and my children? I told you why, Caleb said, his patience visibly fraying. The arrangement benefits us both. You gained protection from the Harringtons and financial security. I gained a safe place to recover and the opportunity to continue my investigation into their illegal activities. A suspiciously neat solution for everyone involved, Emma observed. Except perhaps the Harringtons themselves, who now seem remarkably eager to welcome you into their circle. They want to assess the threat, Caleb explained, running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture of frustration. A new husband with uncertain background and motivations. They need to determine whether I'm an obstacle or an opportunity, whether I might be susceptible to bribery or intimidation. It's a standard tactic for men like Edward Harrington. The explanation made logical sense, but doubt had taken root in Emma's mind. And the missing letter? The one delivered yesterday? Caleb's expression darkened. If a letter was delivered here yesterday, I never saw it. Perhaps your reliable postmaster is mistaken. Or perhaps, he glanced toward the road, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. Perhaps what? Emma pressed. Perhaps the Harringtons are playing a more complex game than we realized, Caleb suggested. Creating doubt between us would certainly serve their interests. That's a convenient explanation, Emma said, though she couldn't entirely dismiss the possibility. The Harringtons had already demonstrated their willingness to manipulate circumstances to their advantage. It's the truth, Caleb stated flatly. Believe what you will, Emma, but I have never betrayed anyone who trusted me. I don't intend to start with you and your children. The simple declaration, delivered without embellishment or excessive protest, carried a ring of sincerity that Emma found difficult to dismiss. Yet doubt, once seated, grew tenaciously. Why would you agree to their invitation? She challenged, changing tack. Surely, you don't think we should actually attend this gathering. On the contrary, Caleb replied, surprising her. I think we should accept. You can't be serious, Emma exclaimed. Walk willingly into whatever trap they're setting? Sometimes the best way to understand your enemy's strategy is to observe it in action, Caleb said, his tone shifting to one of tactical assessment. Besides, the Harrington estate might provide access to information we couldn't obtain otherwise. Information about William's death? Emma surmised. Among other things. Caleb handed the letter back to her. But I wouldn't suggest taking the children. We can make excuses. Childhood illness, perhaps. So you admit it might be dangerous, Emma noted. I'm acknowledging it's unknown territory, Caleb corrected, and in unknown territory one takes precautions. Emma studied him, trying to reconcile the careful, strategic thinker before her with both the desperate outlaw she'd found in her barn and the considerate, hard-working man who'd been splitting wood for her family's winter comfort. Which was the true Caleb Blackwood? Or were they all merely facets of a man far more complex than she'd initially judged? "You have no proof of your claims against the Harringtons," she said finally. "No evidence beyond your own assertions that they arranged William's death or destroyed your family's property." "Not yet," Caleb agreed. "Though I suspect William left something behind that might provide such proof, which is precisely why the Harringtons are so interested in reclaiming his personal effects and bringing his children east." The reference to the hidden map Emma had discovered in William's pocket watch sent a jolt through her. She hadn't shared that discovery with Caleb, uncertain even now how much to trust him with. "Why should I believe you instead of them?" she asked bluntly. "They offer evidence that my husband misappropriated their funds. You offer accusations without proof. Both serve your respective interests." Caleb's expression darkened. "The difference, Emma, is that I'm not trying to separate you from your children or force you from your home. I married you to protect what's yours, not take it away, an arrangement that benefits you substantially as well," she reminded him. "I've never pretended otherwise." Frustration edged his voice. "Unlike the Harringtons, who cloak their greed in family concern and legal obligation." The sharpness of their exchange had escalated beyond what Emma had intended, her suspicions hardening into accusations that left little room for Caleb's defense. Yet beneath her anger lurked genuine fear, not of Caleb himself, but of having misplaced her trust once again, of having endangered her children through another poor decision. Before she could formulate a response that didn't further inflame the situation, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. James and Sarah appeared around the bend in the road, returning early from school on their shared pony, their bright chatter carrying across the yard. The transformation in Caleb was immediate and remarkable. The tension in his shoulders eased, the hard lines of his face softening into welcome as he raised a hand in greeting. By the time the children reached the yard, no trace remained of the heated exchange he'd been engaged in moments earlier. "You're home early," he called, his voice warm with a casualness that belied their previous confrontation. "School let out already?" "Miss Patterson had a headache," James explained, sliding from the pony's back before helping Sarah down. "She said we could go home if we finished our sums, and I did mine in 10 minutes flat." "Impressive," Caleb praised, moving to take the pony's reins. "And did you manage yours as well, Miss Sarah?" Sarah nodded solemnly. "James helped me with the hard ones. Don't tell Ma." "Your secret's safe with me," Caleb assured her with a conspiratorial wink, before glancing toward Emma with perfectly feigned normalcy. "I'll see to the pony if you want to get these scholars some lunch." The easy domesticity of the exchange, the children's obvious comfort with Caleb, the smooth coordination between them as surrogate parents, all of it felt disturbingly natural, as if they truly were the family they pretended to be. Emma found herself responding automatically, gathering Sarah's lunch pail and asking about her day, while Caleb led James and the pony toward the barn, the boy chattering animatedly about some schoolyard adventure. Watching them, Emma felt the uncomfortable sensation of worlds colliding, her suspicions about Caleb's possible duplicity warring with the evident care he showed her son. The heated accusations she'd flung, contrasting sharply with his gentle handling of James's pride and enthusiasm. If Caleb Blackwood was playing a role, he was doing it with a conviction that went beyond mere strategy. And if he wasn't, if his protestations of honest intentions toward her family were genuine, then she had accused an innocent man of the very betrayal he most despised. Either possibility left Emma standing on dangerous ground indeed, with the safety of her family balanced precariously on her judgment of a man she was no longer certain she understood at all. Emma arrived at the schoolhouse that afternoon with her mind still churning over the confrontation with Caleb. The Harringtons' invitation and the mystery of the allegedly delivered letter had left her disquieted, uncertain whom to trust or what to believe. As the modest, white clapboard building came into view, she forced herself to set aside these troubled thoughts. The children needed her undivided attention, not a mother distracted by adult concerns they couldn't possibly understand. Miss Patterson, Silver Creek's young school teacher, usually waited on the steps to greet parents, but today she stood just inside the doorway, her expression uncharacteristically stern. Most of the children had already departed, their high voices echoing across the schoolyard as they raced toward waiting parents or the freedom of the afternoon. Only a few stragglers remained, among them Sarah, who sat on a bench beside the door, swinging her legs and clutching her slate with unusual solemnity. "Where's James?" Emma asked as she approached, immediately concerned by her son's absence and Sarah's subdued demeanor. Miss Patterson's lips pressed into a thin line. "Inside, Mrs. Blackwood. I'm afraid there's been an incident." A chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air settled in Emma's stomach. "Is he hurt?" "Not seriously," the teacher replied, her tone suggesting that James might have been better served by a more substantial injury, though the same can't be said for Thomas Wilson. Emma hurried into the schoolroom, Sarah trailing reluctantly behind her. James sat alone at his desk in the otherwise empty classroom, his head bowed over a sheet of paper upon which he appeared to be writing lines. As he looked up at her entrance, Emma's breath caught in her throat. An angry purple bruise bloomed across her son's left cheekbone, and dried blood crusted at the corner of his split lip. "James William Thornton!" she exclaimed, rushing to kneel beside his desk. "What on earth happened to you?" Her son's expression was a complicated mixture of defiance, embarrassment, and lingering anger. "Nothing," he muttered, looking down at his paper again. "I'm fine." "He got into a fight with Thomas Wilson during the noon recess," Miss Patterson explained, closing the schoolroom door behind them. A most shocking display of violence that resulted in 2 bloody noses, a torn shirt, and language that I will not repeat in present company. Emma touched James's bruised face gently, her heart aching at the evidence of his pain even as her mind filled with questions. James had never been a quarrelsome child, even before William's death had forced him into premature solemnity. "What happened?" she asked, directing the question to her son rather than the teacher. "This isn't like you, Jamie." "Thomas said things," James replied, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "Bad things about you." A sinking feeling settled in Emma's chest. "What things?" James' jaw set stubbornly. "I won't say them. They're not true anyway." Miss Patterson cleared her throat delicately. "I believe the altercation began when Thomas repeated certain unfortunate comments he'd overheard from his father regarding your recent marriage." Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "The blacksmith has never been known for his discretion, particularly after an evening at the saloon." Understanding dawned with painful clarity. Emma had noticed Gregory Wilson's barely disguised contempt at church on Sunday, the way he'd kept his wife and children at a distance as if her hasty remarriage might somehow contaminate them through proximity. That he would voice such sentiments within earshot of his son, and that his son would then carry those poisonous words to school, was distressing, but hardly surprising. "I see," Emma said quietly, and James took exception to these comments. "Quite violently," Miss Patterson confirmed. "He struck Thomas without warning when the boy called you." She caught herself glancing at Sarah, who was listening with wide-eyed attention. "When Thomas made his unkind remark, I've assigned both boys punishment essays on the importance of controlling one's temper and choosing one's words carefully." Emma nodded, appreciating the teacher's attempt at fairness despite the circumstances. "James will complete his assignment," she assured Miss Patterson, "and he'll apologize for disrupting your classroom." "I won't apologize for what I did," James declared, his young face flushing with renewed anger. "Thomas called Ma an outlaw." "That's quite enough," her son subsided, though the stubborn set of his jaw suggested his contrition extended only to his outburst, not to the defense of his mother's honor. Emma squeezed his shoulder gently, her anger at the situation warring with a mother's pride in her son's loyal heart. "Finish your lines," she instructed quietly. "We'll discuss this further at home." While James returned to his punishment, Emma drew Miss Patterson aside. "I apologize for my son's behavior," she said. "These past months have been difficult for the children, with William's death and now my remarriage." The young teacher's expression softened slightly. "Children can be cruel, Mrs. Blackwood, particularly when they're merely parroting their parents' prejudices. James is normally one of my best pupils, studious, respectful, helpful with the younger children. I believe today was an unfortunate aberration rather than a change in character." "Thank you," Emma said, genuinely grateful for the teacher's understanding. "It won't happen again." "See that it doesn't," Ms. Patterson replied, her professional sternness returning. "Regardless of provocation, I cannot allow fighting in my schoolroom." The ride home passed in uncomfortable silence, James stubbornly refusing to discuss the incident further despite Emma's gentle questions. Sarah, sensing the tension, occupied herself with a whispered conversation with her rag doll, occasionally casting worried glances at her brother's bruised face. As their homestead came into view, Emma's heart sank further at the sight of Caleb splitting logs in the yard. The last thing James needed was another confrontation, especially with his new stepfather, who might view the boys fighting as either admirable or disgraceful, depending on his mood. Either response would only complicate an already difficult situation. To her surprise, Caleb took one look at James's battered face and set aside his axe without comment, his expression revealing nothing more than mild interest. "Looks like school was eventful today," he observed, helping Sarah down from the wagon with casual gentleness. "Why don't you go inside and wash up? I believe there might be some of those molasses cookies left from yesterday." Sarah needed no further encouragement, darting into the house with eager speed. James followed more slowly, his shoulders hunched defensively as he passed Caleb. If the outlaw noticed the boy's wariness, he gave no sign, merely ruffling James's hair in passing before turning to help Emma down from the wagon seat. "Fighting at school?" he guessed quietly as James disappeared inside. Emma nodded, her emotions still too raw to form a coherent response. The events of the day, her confrontation with Caleb, the Harringtons' invitation, and now James' fight, had left her feeling hollowed out, vulnerable in ways she hadn't experienced since the first terrible weeks after William's death. "He needs time to settle," Caleb said, seemingly understanding her wordless distress. "Let him wash up, have something to eat, we'll talk later." The simple words, offered without judgment or demands, unexpectedly steadied Emma. "Thank you," she managed, though whether for his practical suggestion or his unobtrusive support, she couldn't have said. Evening settled over the homestead, the children finally asleep after a quiet supper, where James had picked at his food and Sarah had attempted to fill the uncomfortable silence with increasingly elaborate stories about her doll's adventures. Emma moved through the kitchen, mechanically completing her nightly chores, washing dishes, sweeping the floor, preparing for tomorrow's breakfast, while her mind circled the day's troubles without finding resolution. She had just banked the fire for the night when she noticed the lamplight still burning in the front room. Caleb sat at the small table near the window, William's revolver disassembled before him as he methodically cleaned each component. His hands moved with practiced precision, the familiar ritual apparently requiring little conscious thought. Emma paused in the doorway, momentarily transported back to evenings when William had performed the same task in the same spot, his quiet competence a reassuring counterpoint to the dangers that lurked beyond their door. The similarity between the two men in that moment, one her beloved husband, the other an outlaw she'd married out of desperate necessity, unsettled her deeply. Caleb glanced up, apparently sensing her presence. "The children settled?" "Yes," Emma replied, stepping into the room despite her misgivings, though I doubt James will sleep soundly with that bruised cheek. "Raw beefsteak would help with the swelling," Caleb observed, though I imagine we'd be hard-pressed to sacrifice any of our winter meat for a schoolyard injury. "It wasn't just a schoolyard scuffle," Emma said, sinking into the chair across from him. "Miss Patterson told me what happened. Thomas Wilson called me." She hesitated, the crude insult catching in her throat. "An outlaw's whore," Caleb supplied, his voice matter-of-fact rather than angry. At Emma's startled look, he shrugged slightly. "It's not difficult to guess. Gregory Wilson was watching us like a hawk in church on Sunday, practically pulling his family to the other side of the aisle when we entered. The man has the subtlety of a bull in a china shop, especially after a few drinks." The casual accuracy of his assessment momentarily robbed Emma of words. "James shouldn't have resorted to violence," she said finally, falling back on maternal certainty when all else seemed shifting and uncertain. "Fighting solves nothing. On the contrary, Caleb replied, his hands never pausing in their work as he reassembled the revolver with quick, sure movements. Sometimes it solves a great deal. The boy stood up for his mother's honor. William raised a good son. His approval, so at odds with what Emma had expected, caught her off guard. William doesn't know him anymore, she responded bitterly, the stress of the day cracking her usual composure. He's growing up with an outlaw for a stepfather instead. The barb landed as she'd intended, Caleb's hands stilling momentarily on the gun barrel. Yet when he looked up, his expression held neither anger nor offense, only a quiet thoughtfulness that was somehow more disconcerting than any reaction she'd anticipated. "Then I'll have to make sure I'm worthy of the role, won't I?" he said simply. The response, so unlike what Emma had expected, effectively silenced her. She watched as Caleb continued his work, seating the cylinder back into the frame with meticulous care. His gentle handling of the deadly weapon, like his unexpectedly nuanced response to James's fight, hinted at complexities she was only beginning to glimpse. "I don't want my son learning that violence is an acceptable solution to insults," she said finally, needing to establish some boundary in this increasingly confusing terrain. "Nor should he," Caleb agreed, surprising her again. "But neither should he learn that a man stands idle while those he loves are mistreated. There's a balance to be found, Emma, a middle ground between turning the other cheek and striking the first blow." "And you'll teach him this middle ground, will you?" Emma couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. "A man who solves his problems with a gun?" Caleb checked the revolver's action one final time before setting it aside, his attention now fully on Emma. "I wasn't always the man you found bleeding in your barn," he said quietly. "The choices I've made, some good, many bad, don't erase what I was taught growing up. Honor, discretion, protecting those who cannot protect themselves." The simple statement, delivered without defensiveness or justification, reminded Emma of their midnight conversation in the kitchen. The glimpses of Caleb's past, his service in the Union Army, his education, his lost family, suggested a foundation far more solid than the outlaw reputation he now carried. "James needs guidance," she acknowledged, her voice softening slightly. "A boy becoming a man has questions a mother can't always answer." "Let me speak with him," Caleb suggested. Not to praise his fighting, but to help him understand when standing his ground is necessary and when walking away demonstrates greater strength. The request, for it was a request, not a demand, despite Caleb's legal right as stepfather to address James however he saw fit, touched Emma unexpectedly. This considerate approach to her son's needs, this recognition of her authority as mother while offering masculine guidance where appropriate, spoke of a respect she hadn't anticipated. "Very well," she agreed cautiously. "But nothing that glorifies violence or revenge." "You have my word," Caleb promised, his blue eyes holding hers steadily. "Whatever else I may be, Emma, I take my responsibilities to children seriously. Especially these children." Something in his tone, a quiet conviction that transcended their arranged marriage, made Emma believe him, despite her lingering doubts about his connection to the Harringtons. In this, at least, she sensed absolute truth. Caleb Blackwood would not harm her children, either physically or through poor counsel. The realization was simultaneously reassuring and terrifying. For if she could trust him with her children's welfare, what other parts of him might prove trustworthy? And where would that leave the careful boundaries she'd established around her heart? The first snow of the season arrived the following week, transforming the homestead overnight into a fairyland of white that drew exclamations of delight from Sarah and sent James rushing outside before breakfast to assess the accumulation. Emma stood at the kitchen window, watching her children's excited exploration of the newly whitened world, their breath forming clouds in the crisp morning air. "About 4 inches, Caleb observed from beside her, handing her a cup of coffee he'd prepared while she was dressing. "Enough to be pretty, not enough to cause trouble, though there's more on the way if those clouds are any indication." Emma accepted the coffee with murmured thanks, still adjusting to the domestic partnership that had developed between them during the past week. The confrontation over the Harringtons' invitation had gradually given way to a tentative truce, their shared responsibilities for the children and homestead creating a rhythm that felt almost natural despite its artificial foundation. "Will it delay your trip to town?" she asked, referencing his planned journey to meet with a supposed cattle broker, though Emma suspected the real purpose was to gather information about the Harringtons' movements. "Unlikely," Caleb replied, sipping his own coffee as he watched the children through the window. "The road should be passable, and the Mount Porter loaned me is sure-foot in worse conditions than this." Emma nodded, a small worry easing. Despite her lingering suspicions about Caleb's possible connection to the Harringtons, she'd come to rely on his presence at the homestead. His capabilities exceeded even William's in some respects, practical skills honed by years of self-reliance in harsh conditions. In the weeks since James's fight, Caleb had repaired the roof where summer storms had loosened several shingles, reinforced the chicken coop against the fox that had been decimating their flock, built a proper storage shed for the winter wood supply, keeping it dry and close to the house, taught James to set rabbit snares, providing fresh meat for their table 3 days running. More remarkable than these practical contributions was the change in her children. James, initially wary and resentful, had gradually warmed to Caleb after their private conversation following the schoolyard fight. Whatever Caleb had said had settled something in her son, easing the defensive brittleness that had characterized his behavior since William's death. He followed Caleb about the homestead like a shadow whenever chores permitted, soaking up knowledge of masculine skills with an eagerness that made Emma's heart ache for all the father-son moments William had missed. Sarah, less burdened by memories of her father, had accepted Caleb with the open-heartedness of childhood. Her initial shyness had given way to chatter, questions, and demands for attention that Caleb met with surprising patience. Just yesterday, Emma had returned from gathering eggs to find Sarah perched on Caleb's knee, solemnly instructing him on the proper way to comb her doll's yarn hair, while he listened with exaggerated concentration. "They'll need new boots before the deep snow comes," Caleb remarked, drawing Emma from her thoughts. "James has nearly outgrown his, and Sarah's are worn through at the toes." "I know," Emma sighed, the familiar worry about finances surfacing despite the mortgage being paid. "I've been putting aside egg money, but with winter coming—" "I'll take care of it," Caleb interrupted gently, "while I'm in town today. Just tell me their sizes." The casual offer of financial support, delivered without fanfare or expectation of gratitude, reminded Emma yet again that this was no ordinary marriage. Caleb's funds, however dubiously acquired, had not only saved her home but continued providing for her family's needs, without the struggling economy most frontier households endured. "You don't need to do that," she protested automatically, old pride rising to the surface. "We've managed before." "Managing isn't the same as thriving," Caleb pointed out. "And there's no sense in children having cold feet when the means to prevent it are readily available." The practical wisdom of this argument was unanswerable. Emma nodded, accepting his offer with as much grace as she could muster. "Thank you." Caleb's mouth quirked in the half-smile that had become increasingly familiar. "You're welcome, Mrs. Blackwood." The use of her married name still sent an odd shiver through Emma, a reminder of their legal bond despite its pragmatic foundation. Before she could formulate a response, the back door burst open, admitting a flurry of snow and 2 excited children. "Ma! Caleb! Can we build a snow fort?" James asked, his cheeks ruddy with cold and excitement. "There's enough by the big pine to make walls and everything." "After breakfast and chores," Emma replied automatically. "And you'll need proper mittens, not those thin gloves." "I'll help you after I return from town," Caleb promised, earning a whoop of delight from James and a clapping of mittened hands from Sarah. "A proper fort requires engineering expertise after all." "With a secret tunnel?" James pressed, his eyes alight with boyish enthusiasm. "And a lookout tower?" "We'll see what the snow permits," Caleb replied, his serious tone belied by the warmth in his eyes. "Now wash up for breakfast before your mother's biscuits get cold." The children scampered to obey, leaving puddles of melting snow in their wake. Emma moved to wipe up the mess, her heart oddly full at the domestic scene. So normal, so natural, as if Caleb had always been part of their family, rather than a recent and temporary addition. "You're good with them," she said quietly as she worked. "Better than I expected." Caleb shrugged, though pleasure at the rare compliment briefly softened his features. Children are generally easy to understand. They want security, attention, and clear boundaries. Adults are far more complicated. The observation, like many of Caleb's insights, revealed a depth of understanding that contradicted Emma's initial assessment of him. Each day seemed to uncover new layers to the man she'd married, complexity that simultaneously intrigued and unsettled her. That evening, after a day of snow play, chores, and the promised fort building, Emma entered the front room to find a scene that stopped her in her tracks. Caleb sat on the sofa, a child tucked against each side, reading aloud from one of her precious books, a collection of Greek myths that had been among William's favorites. His deep voice rose and fell with the rhythm of the story, bringing to life the tale of Theseus and the Minotaur with dramatic emphasis that had both children utterly enthralled. More surprising than his storytelling skill was the evident ease with which he handled the unfamiliar Greek names and classical references. He read, not as a man laboriously sounding out difficult words, but as one thoroughly familiar with classical education. Yet another incongruity in the outlaw she thought she'd begun to understand. Emma stood silently in the doorway, unwilling to interrupt the moment. Sarah leaned trustingly against Caleb's side, her thumb creeping toward her mouth as it always did when she was engrossed in a story. James sat straighter, trying to maintain a more mature demeanor, but his expression was just as captivated as his sister's. Only when the chapter concluded did Emma make her presence known, stepping into the lamplight with a soft rustle of skirts. "Time for bed, children. You can continue the story tomorrow." Predictable protests followed, but Caleb closed the book with firm finality. "Your mother's right. Heroes and monsters will wait for tomorrow. Off to bed now." The children obeyed with minimal grumbling, pausing for Emma's goodnight kisses before heading to their room. When they were gone, Emma settled into the chair across from Caleb, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. "You read very well," she observed. "Those Greek names would trip up most men." Caleb set the book aside, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. "I had excellent teachers." In a one-room schoolhouse on the frontier, Emma pressed gently, sensing there was more to the story. A flicker of something, memory perhaps, or regret, crossed Caleb's face. "No," he admitted after a moment. "My education was considerably more formal, at least initially. My mother was a schoolteacher back in Pennsylvania before she married my father. Being an outlaw doesn't mean I was born one." The simple statement, offered without defensiveness or elaboration, revealed more of Caleb's history than any previous conversation. Emma could picture it now, a bright boy with those same intense blue eyes, raised by an educated mother who instilled in him a love of learning that persisted despite the harsh turns his life had taken. "She taught you well," Emma said softly. "Your mother." "She did her best," Caleb agreed, his voice carrying a warmth reserved for this memory. "Believed education was the path to a better life, though circumstances eventually proved her wrong in my case." The glimpse into his past, freely offered rather than extracted through questioning, felt strangely intimate, more personal than physical proximity could have been. This sharing of history, of the formative influences that had shaped him before life's hardships intervened, created a connection Emma hadn't anticipated when she'd entered their pragmatic arrangement. "What happened to her?" she asked, instinctively knowing the answer wouldn't be happy. "Influenza?" Caleb replied, his gaze fixed on some middle distance where memory resided. "Winter of '59. My father followed 6 months later. Heart, supposedly. Though I've always believed it was simply that he couldn't bear to continue without her." Emma's own heart contracted at the quiet pain underlying his words. "I'm sorry." Caleb shook off the moment of vulnerability with visible effort, his expression returning to its usual guarded composure. "It was a long time ago." But not so long, Emma thought, that the wound had fully healed. This man who read Greek myths to her children, who stood up to the Harringtons on her behalf, who uncomplainingly provided for a family not his own, this man carried losses as profound as her own, perhaps deeper for having faced them without the support she'd found in her children and community. "Thank you," she said softly, for sharing that with me. Caleb met her gaze across the lamplight, something unguarded and genuine in his expression. Some secrets are worth keeping, Emma. My mother's memory isn't one of them. The simple statement, the trust it represented, touched Emma more deeply than she cared to admit. As she rose to bank the fire for the night, she found herself wondering what other aspects of Caleb Blackwood might prove equally worthy of discovery, and whether their temporary arrangement would allow time enough to uncover them. Chapter 7. Snowbound. December arrived with a bitter vengeance, transforming the gentle beauty of autumn's first snow into an ominous promise of winter's fury. The mountains surrounding Silver Creek disappeared behind banks of steely gray clouds that hung low over the valley, their underbellies dark with impending storm. Old-timers studied the sky with knowing eyes, predicting the season's first true blizzard with the certainty of those who had survived dozens before. Emma felt the changing pressure in her bones as she checked items off her list at Miller's General Store. The shelves were already half empty, other families having heeded the same primal warning that had sent her and Caleb to town despite the biting cold. Flour, coffee, sugar, salt, lamp oil, the essentials for enduring days of isolation when the world beyond their doorstep became an impassable sea of white. Better add more candles, Caleb suggested, appearing at her elbow with 2 extra boxes. And perhaps another tin of kerosene. The light goes early these days. Emma nodded, adding them to their growing pile of supplies. After nearly 2 months of marriage, their coordination had developed an easy rhythm that belied the unconventional foundation of their relationship. Caleb anticipated her needs almost before she voiced them, his practical assessment of their situation complementing her careful planning. "Do you think we have enough flour?" she asked, eyeing the dwindling stock on Miller's shelves. "Take another 10 pounds if Herbert has it to spare," Caleb replied. "Better to have surplus than shortage if this storm lives up to its promise." Mr. Miller, overhearing as he wrapped a customer's parcel, nodded emphatically. "Your husband's got the right of it, Mrs. Blackwood. Silas Jenkins came in from his place up north this morning. Says he's never seen the animals heading for shelter so early in the season. When the creatures know something's coming, wise folks listen." "Then we'll take whatever flour you can spare, Mr. Miller," Emma decided. "And perhaps some of those peppermint sticks for the children. They've been especially helpful preparing for the storm." The storekeeper's wife appeared from the storeroom, her face brightening at the sight of Emma and Caleb. Unlike some in town who still regarded their hasty marriage with suspicion, Abigail Miller had embraced the romantic notion of a widow finding unexpected love. It helped, Emma supposed, that Caleb had proved himself a model citizen during the past weeks, attending church regularly, participating in the town's Thanksgiving celebration, and generally presenting himself as a respectable businessman rather than the notorious outlaw he truly was. "You two are wise to stock up," Mrs. Miller declared, bustling forward to assist her husband. "This storm has a feeling about it. My grandmother had the sight for weather, and I inherited just enough to know when trouble's brewing." She leaned closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Though being snowed in with a handsome husband is hardly the worst fate for a young woman, is it?" Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks. Despite weeks of carefully maintained propriety within their household, the town naturally assumed their marriage included all traditional aspects of the relationship. Caleb, seeming to sense her discomfort, smoothly directed Mrs. Miller's attention to their list of supplies, allowing Emma a moment to compose herself. As Herbert Miller tallied their purchases, Emma moved to the window, watching snowflakes begin to swirl down from the laden sky. They were small yet, mere harbingers of the storm to come, but already they danced with an intensity that spoke of deepening cold and accumulating drifts. "Penny for your thoughts," Caleb said quietly, joining her at the window. "Just hoping James and Sarah are staying warm at school," Emma replied. Ms. Patterson promised to dismiss the children early if the snow began in earnest. "I'm sure they're fine," Caleb assured her, "and likely excited about the prospect of snow days ahead." Emma smiled, acknowledging the truth in his words. Her children had been practically vibrating with anticipation since the first mention of the coming storm, already planning snowball fights and sledding adventures, despite her warnings about the blizzard's dangers. "We should head home soon," she observed as the snowflakes grew larger, more purposeful in their descent. "I don't like the look of those clouds." Caleb nodded his agreement, moving to help Mr. Miller gather their parcels. Emma remained at the window, watching as the town's residents hurried about their last-minute preparations. Across the street, Sheriff Taylor emerged from his office, turning his face to the sky with an expression of weathered resignation, before heading purposefully toward the general store. "Sheriff's coming," Emma murmured as Caleb returned to her side. "He's been watching for an opportunity to speak with you all week." Caleb's expression didn't change, though she felt a subtle tension enter his posture. Has he now? I can't imagine why the good sheriff would take such interest in a simple cattle buyer. The mild irony in his tone earned him a warning glance from Emma just as the bell above the door announced Taylor's arrival. Snow dusted the sheriff's broad shoulders and wide-brimmed hat, evidence of the storm's increasing determination. "Afternoon, Mrs. Blackwood, Mr. Blackwood." Taylor greeted them with a tip of his hat. "Stocking up for the duration, I see." "Just being prudent," Caleb replied easily. "I understand this valley can be isolated for days when a proper storm hits." "That it can," Taylor agreed. "First winter in Silver Creek, isn't it? Different from what you're used to in Kansas, I'd imagine." The casual reference to Caleb's supposed previous territory carried a subtle probing that Emma didn't miss. After 2 months, the sheriff still hadn't abandoned his suspicions about her husband's convenient appearance and mysterious background. "Weather's weather," Caleb responded with a non-committal shrug, "though I'll admit Colorado has a particularly challenging variety of it." Taylor smiled, though the expression didn't quite reach his eyes. "Indeed it does. Speaking of challenges, I received an interesting telegraph from the marshal over in Summit County yesterday. Seems there've been sightings of the Blackwood gang north of here." Emma felt, rather than saw, Caleb's infinitesimal stillness, a predator's instinctive pause before deciding whether to attack or retreat. His voice, however, remained casually interested. "Is that so? I thought that gang had moved on to more profitable territories after hitting our bank." "Apparently not," Taylor replied, his gaze never leaving Caleb's face. "Marshall thinks they might be holed up for winter somewhere in these mountains. Odd coincidence, them sharing your name." "Not so odd," Caleb countered smoothly. "Blackwood's a common enough surname back east, though I confess it's caused me some discomfort since arriving here. People tend to look twice when they hear it." Taylor nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I imagine they do." He glanced toward the window where the snow now fell in earnest, thick flakes obscuring the view of the street. "Storm's setting in faster than expected. You folks should get on home before the roads become impassable." "We were just leaving," Emma confirmed, gathering her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. "If you need anything during the storm," Taylor added, his tone shifting to genuine neighborliness that still carried an undercurrent of watchfulness, "don't hesitate to send word. I'll be checking on outlying homesteads once it's safe to ride out." "That's very kind," Emma replied sincerely. "Though we're well prepared." "I'm sure you are." Taylor's gaze moved between them, assessing in a way that made Emma acutely aware of every nuance in their interaction. "Safe travels home, then. And Mr. Blackwood." He extended his hand toward Caleb in a gesture that seemed both friendly and challenging. Caleb accepted the handshake without hesitation, his expression pleasantly neutral. "Sheriff," only when they were loading their supplies into the wagon, the snow falling thick enough now to cloak them in relative privacy, did Emma allow her concern to surface. "He suspects something," she murmured, securing a crate of provisions beneath the wagon seat. "Of course he does," Caleb replied, his voice low as he checked the harness on their horse. "Taylor's a good lawman, suspicious by nature and training." "Hammond mentioned your gang," Emma pressed, unable to ignore the disquiet that had plagued her since the sheriff's casual reference. "Sightings to the north, is it true?" Caleb glanced at her, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his snow-dusted hat. "If the marshal reported sightings, I assume so." "That's not what I asked," Emma said, her voice sharper than intended. "Are your men nearby? Have you been in contact with them?" A faint line appeared between Caleb's brows as he finished securing their purchases. "Not since before our marriage," he answered finally, "as I promised you." The simple statement should have reassured her, yet something in his tone, a subtle evasiveness perhaps, or merely her own lingering doubts, left Emma unsatisfied. "But you expected them to be in the area," she pressed. "You're not surprised by the marshal's report?" Caleb sighed. his breath forming a cloud in the frigid air. "The northern valleys provide good winter shelter," he acknowledged. "Steep walls for protection from wind, plentiful game, few travelers. It would be a logical choice for men wanting to avoid attention until spring." "Men like your former companions," Emma concluded. "Yes." Caleb helped her onto the wagon seat before climbing up beside her. The small space forced a proximity that Emma found both comforting and disconcerting, his solid presence a barrier against the intensifying cold, yet a reminder of how thoroughly their lives had entangled. "But I've had no contact with them, Emma. I gave you my word." She studied his profile as he took up the reins, searching for signs of deception. 2 months of close quarters had taught her much about Caleb Blackwood's expressions and mannerisms, yet parts of him remained as mysterious as the day she'd found him wounded in her barn. "The sheriff will be watching more closely now," she observed as they pulled away from the hitching post. "If your men are indeed nearby, a chance encounter could prove disastrous." "I'm aware," Caleb replied, his attention apparently focused on guiding the horse through the thickening snow. "Which is why I've been careful to establish routines and connections that support my identity as a cattle buyer. The Wilsons have even agreed to claim I stayed with them before our marriage should anyone press for details." The revelation startled Emma. The blacksmith's family? But after what Thomas said to James at school, "Ada Wilson is more sympathetic than her husband," Caleb explained, "and not above earning a bit of extra money for winter by supporting a harmless fiction." "You paid them," Emma realized, "to lie for you." "I compensated them for potential difficulties should the fiction be discovered," Caleb corrected, a hint of impatience entering his tone. "It's protection, Emma, for all of us." The pragmatic explanation made sense, yet Emma found herself troubled by how effectively Caleb managed his deceptions, creating alibis, establishing background, manipulating perceptions. These were not the skills of an ordinary man, nor even an ordinary criminal. They spoke of someone accustomed to living within webs of fabrication so intricate that truth and falsehood became nearly indistinguishable. Such a man would find it easy to lie to a widow desperate to save her home, easy to pretend concern for her children while pursuing his own agenda, easy to present himself as protector rather than threat when circumstances demanded. As the wagon creaked homeward through the deepening snow, Emma found her earlier confidence in their arrangement shaken by renewed doubt. The storm gathered force around them, much like the questions swirling through her mind, questions she wasn't certain she wanted answered, for fear of what truths might be revealed. By nightfall, the blizzard had arrived in full, vengeful fury. Wind howled around the corners of the homestead, driving snow against the windows with such force that Emma half expected the glass to shatter. Drifts formed with unnatural speed, transforming familiar landmarks into alien shapes visible only when lightning occasionally illuminated the swirling whiteness. Inside, the small house had become a fortress against nature's assault. Emma had drawn heavy curtains across the windows, their faded fabric an inadequate but necessary barrier against drafts. The stove blazed with the last logs from the indoor wood pile, though Caleb had stacked additional cordwood on the covered porch before the storm made outdoor movement treacherous. "Will the chickens be all right?" Sarah asked, anxiously, her face pressed against the window glass despite Emma's repeated warnings about catching cold. "They must be scared of the thunder." "They're snug in their coop," Caleb assured her, gently drawing her away from the window. "Extra straw for warmth, plenty of feed, and the structure's sound enough to withstand worse than this." Sarah's lower lip trembled slightly, her concern for the chickens transparent camouflage for her own anxiety about the storm's violence. "I promise," Caleb replied, with the gravity adults reserve for children's most serious concerns. "And tomorrow, if the storm has passed, we'll go check on them together." The simple reassurance calmed Sarah visibly, her small shoulders relaxing beneath Caleb's comforting hand. Emma, watching from where she stirred a pot of stew on the stove, felt a peculiar tightness in her chest. These small kindnesses, Caleb's patient answers to Sarah's endless questions, his matter-of-fact inclusion of her in important tasks, his willingness to address her fears without dismissal or condescension, had become so routine that Emma sometimes forgot their remarkable nature. This man, whom she'd once known only as a dangerous outlaw, had slipped into the role of surrogate father with an ease that defied explanation. Whatever Caleb Blackwood had been before entering their lives, whatever deceptions might underlie their arrangement, his genuine affection for her children appeared beyond question. "Something smells delicious," Caleb observed, drawing Sarah toward the kitchen where James already sat at the table, carefully dealing playing cards. "What do you think, Miss Sarah? Is your mother's stew ready yet?" "Almost," Emma replied, grateful for the distraction from her complicated thoughts. "James, please get the bowls down. Sarah, you can set out the spoons." The children hurried to comply, their earlier restlessness channeled into purposeful activity. James had been particularly helpful throughout the afternoon, assisting Caleb with storm preparations without complaint or argument. The change in her son over the past weeks had been remarkable, his defensive brittleness softening, his perpetual worry easing as adult male guidance relieved him of responsibilities too heavy for his young shoulders. "What game were you teaching them?" Emma asked as Caleb moved to help her transfer the heavy pot from stove to table. "5-card draw," he replied, his expression innocently bland, with dried beans as betting chips. "You're teaching my children to gamble?" Emma kept her voice low, though a hint of real concern edged her whisper. Caleb's mouth quirked in the half-smile that had become irritatingly familiar. "I'm teaching them probability, strategy, and how to calculate risk versus reward. Essential life skills, wouldn't you say?" Emma found herself biting back an unexpected smile of her own. "You're impossible." "So I've been told," he agreed, his voice warm with humor, "usually by women of excellent judgment." The casual banter, developed over weeks of shared domesticity, felt dangerously natural, as if they truly were husband and wife rather than reluctant allies bound by necessity and legal fiction. Emma turned away, busying herself with serving the stew to hide the confusion that increasingly plagued her when Caleb's guard dropped to reveal the charming, intelligent man beneath the outlaw's reputation. Dinner passed with surprising pleasantness despite the storm's continuing assault. The children, far from being frightened by the blizzard's fury, seemed to find adventure in their enforced confinement. James regaled them with an elaborate tale about explorers trapped in an Arctic ice floe, while Sarah contributed increasingly improbable suggestions for escape involving friendly polar bears and magical sleds. Caleb listened with apparently genuine interest, asking questions that expanded the children's narrative while gently correcting geographical misconceptions. His knowledge of northern territories, like so many aspects of his education, hinted at experiences far removed from the outlaw life he now led. "Have you ever seen a real polar bear, Caleb?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with fascination at the possibility. "Can't say that I have," he admitted, "though I once tracked a grizzly through 3 feet of snow in Montana territory. Magnificent creature, paws the size of dinner plates and a roar you could feel in your bones." "Did you shoot it?" James asked eagerly. "No." Caleb's expression turned reflective. Didn't seem right somehow. It was on its own land, minding its business. I was the intruder. The simple statement revealed a philosophy Emma wouldn't have expected from a man who lived by violence and theft. This consideration for natural order, this respect for boundaries, even with dangerous creatures, added yet another contradictory layer to her understanding of Caleb Blackwood. After dinner, with dishes washed and put away, the evening stretched before them. Long hours of confinement with no escape from each other's company. In previous weeks, Caleb had often retreated to the barn during evenings, ostensibly to care for the livestock, but clearly also to provide Emma and the children private family time. Tonight, with outdoors rendered inaccessible by the storm, such escape was impossible. To Emma's surprise, the enforced togetherness unfolded with unexpected harmony. Caleb occupied James with a card game more complex than the afternoon's lessons, explaining strategies in a patient murmur that had her son's face furrowed in concentration. Sarah curled beside Emma on the small sofa, helping to sort buttons by color and size, a simple task that delighted her pattern-loving mind. When the button sorting concluded, Sarah tugged hopefully at Emma's sleeve. "Will you read to us, Mama?" "The Night Story." Emma glanced at the worn copy of Ivanhoe that sat on the small bookshelf, William's favorite, which she'd been reading to the children in small portions to maintain their connection to their father. "I suppose we could manage another chapter before bedtime." "Yes, please." Sarah scrambled to retrieve the book while James and Caleb abandoned their card game to join them near the fire. The seating arrangements presented a minor dilemma. The sofa accommodated 3 at most, and only if one was Sarah's size. After a moment's hesitation, Emma settled in the center with Sarah beside her, leaving James to sit on the braided rug at her feet. Caleb took the single armchair adjacent to the sofa, his long frame relaxed yet attentive as Emma opened the book to their marked place. She began reading, her voice lifting and falling with the drama of Walter Scott's medieval tale. The children listened with varying degrees of comprehension, Sarah mainly enthralled by the rhythm of the language, James following the plot with intense concentration. Caleb's attention seemed equally engaged, his expression thoughtful as the story unfolded. When Emma's voice began to tire, he surprised her by offering to continue. "If you'd like a rest," he suggested, extending his hand for the book. Emma hesitated only briefly before passing it to him. Caleb took up the narrative seamlessly, his deep voice bringing new resonance to the tale of the disinherited knight and his adventures. He read with unexpected eloquence, neither stumbling over Scott's archaic language nor overplaying the dramatic passages. Sarah gradually slumped against Emma's side, her eyelids growing heavy despite her determination to remain awake for the story. By the chapter's conclusion, she had surrendered entirely to sleep, her thumb creeping toward her mouth in the unconscious gesture she reverted to when especially tired or content. "I believe we've lost one of our audience members," Caleb observed quietly, closing the book with a finger marking their place. Emma smiled down at her daughter's peaceful face. "She fought valiantly, but sleep has claimed victory." "As it should," Caleb replied, rising from his chair to set the book aside. "It's well past her usual bedtime." "I'm not tired," James protested automatically, though his badly stifled yawn betrayed him. "Of course not," Caleb agreed with mock seriousness. "Strong young men like yourself hardly need sleep at all, but perhaps you might escort your mother to put Sarah to bed? I need to check the fire and secure things for the night." The suggestion, framed as request for assistance rather than a command to retire, preserved James's dignity while accomplishing the necessary task. Emma gave Caleb a grateful glance as she gently gathered her sleeping daughter into her arms. "Come along, Jamie," she said softly. "Help me with the doors." James followed, his resistance to bedtime forgotten in the importance of assisting with his sister. As Emma settled Sarah into bed, removing her shoes and loosening her clothing without fully waking her, James hovered nearby with unusual solemnity. "Do you think the storm will last all night, Ma?" he asked, his voice pitched low to avoid disturbing his sister. "Likely so," Emma replied, tucking blankets securely around Sarah's small form. "But we're safe and warm inside, no need to worry." James nodded, though something in his expression suggested his thoughts ran deeper than simple concern about the weather. "Caleb knows a lot about storms," he observed, "and animals, and cards." "Yes, he does." Emma straightened, studying her son's thoughtful face. "He's lived an eventful life. Was Paul like that?" James asked suddenly. "Did he know about tracking and building things and telling stories?" The question caught Emma unprepared, a sharp pang of mingled grief and guilt striking her heart. She'd tried so hard to keep William's memory alive for the children, yet inevitably details faded, replaced by new experiences and relationships. James had been barely 6 when his father died, old enough to remember, yet young enough that those memories would grow increasingly indistinct with time. "Your father knew different things," she said carefully, leading James toward his own bed in the small room the children shared. "He was a fine miner with an engineer's mind. He could look at a mountainside and tell you where valuable ore might be found. He built this house with his own hands, planning every beam and joint before cutting a single piece of wood." James considered this as he removed his boots, but he didn't know about cards or animals like Caleb. "No," Emma admitted. "Those weren't his particular skills. Every man has different gifts, Jamie. Your father's were no less valuable for being different from Caleb's." Her son nodded, seeming satisfied with this explanation as he climbed into bed. Emma pulled the quilt up around his shoulders, brushing dark hair from his forehead with gentle fingers. Sleep well, my brave boy. I'll see you in the morning. Night, Ma, James murmured, his eyelids already drooping despite his earlier protests about not being tired. Emma paused in the doorway, watching her children's peaceful forms for a moment before quietly closing the door. The simple question, was Pa like that, lingered in her mind, raising complexities she'd avoided confronting directly. Caleb had indeed brought skills and knowledge into their household that William hadn't possessed. His adaptability, his practical wilderness knowledge, his ease with children's questions and concerns. These qualities complemented Emma's own capabilities in ways that sometimes made daily life smoother than it had been even when William was alive. The realization brought a stab of disloyalty that Emma quickly suppressed. Acknowledging Caleb's positive contributions didn't diminish William's memory or importance. Yet it complicated the temporary, pragmatic nature of her arrangement with the outlaw who was legally, if not emotionally, her husband. When she returned to the front room, she found Caleb banking the fire for the night, his movements efficient and practiced. The wind still howled outside, but the small house felt secure against its fury, warm and sheltered in a way that went beyond mere physical comfort. "The children are asleep?" he asked, straightening from his task. "Nearly so," Emma confirmed, moving to extinguish one of the lamps to conserve oil. "Sarah didn't even wake when I put her to bed." "She had an eventful day," Caleb observed. "Storm excitement, button sorting, knights and fair maidens." Enough to exhaust anyone, particularly someone of her enthusiasm. Emma smiled, despite herself. She does approach life with considerable vigor, like her mother. The simple observation, offered without flattery or agenda, caught Emma off guard. Caleb continued before she could formulate a response. James seemed thoughtful tonight. Is everything all right? The perceptiveness of the question, Caleb's genuine concern for her son's emotional state, added another layer to Emma's already complicated feelings. "He asked if William was like you," she admitted, "if his father knew the same things you've been teaching him." Caleb's expression sobered. "Ah." He moved away from the fire, maintaining a respectful distance that nonetheless felt more intimate than their usual careful interactions. "And what did you tell him?" "That every man has different gifts," Emma replied. "That William's were no less valuable for being different from yours." "A wise answer," Caleb said quietly. "And a generous one considering the circumstances." Emma shook her head slightly, uncertain what he meant. "Generous?" "To include me in the comparison at all," Caleb clarified. "You could have simply focused on William's virtues without acknowledging mine." The implicit assumption that she had indeed recognized virtues in him, that she saw beyond the outlaw to the man beneath, hung in the air between them. Emma found herself unable to deny it, though admitting it aloud seemed equally impossible. The fire crackled in the sudden silence, shadows dancing across the small room as wind rattled the windows in their frames. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, but within these walls, a different kind of storm gathered. Unspoken feelings, unacknowledged connections, the inevitable intimacy created by shared space and purpose. "It's late," Emma said finally, retreating to practical matters, as she always did when emotions threatened to overwhelm her. "We should get some rest. The children will be up early, storm or no storm." "Of course," Caleb agreed, though something in his expression suggested he recognized her tactical withdrawal. "I'll make up the sofa after I check the livestock one last time." "You can't go out in this," Emma protested, genuinely concerned. "The barn's only 50 yards away, but in this whiteout—" "I've negotiated worse," Caleb assured her. "I'll tie a guide rope from porch to barn. 10 minutes to make sure they're settled, then I'll return." Emma wanted to object further, but the quiet confidence in his tone stopped her. This was one of Caleb's strengths, assessing risk accurately, neither minimizing genuine danger nor exaggerating manageable challenges. If he believed he could safely check the animals, likely he could. "Very well," she conceded. "But be careful." Caleb's mouth quirked in that familiar half-smile. "Why, Mrs. Blackwood, I do believe you're concerned for my welfare." "I'm concerned about explaining to my children why their stepfather froze to death 50 feet from safety," Emma retorted, though without real heat. "It would be most inconvenient." Heaven forbid I inconvenience you, Caleb replied, his blue eyes warming with humor as he reached for his heavy coat. I'll return shortly. Don't wait up on my account. But Emma did wait, unable to settle until she heard the back door open and close again 10 minutes later, followed by the sound of boots being stomped free of snow on the mat. Caleb reappeared in the doorway between kitchen and front room, his face reddened by cold, but his expression satisfied. All secure, he reported, shrugging out of his snow-dusted coat. The barn's warm enough and the animals are settled. We might lose some snow through that gap in the north corner, but nothing that can't be managed come morning. Thank you, Emma said simply, for checking on them. Caleb nodded, accepting her gratitude without elaboration as he moved to prepare his makeshift bed on the sofa. Emma should have retreated to her bedroom then, maintaining the careful separation they'd established, despite legal bonds that would have permitted much greater intimacy. Yet something held her in place. Perhaps the storm's isolating force, perhaps the evening's unexpected harmony, perhaps simply the human need for connection in the face of nature's overwhelming power. It's strange, she found herself saying, how quickly routine becomes familiar. A few months ago, you were a stranger bleeding in my barn. Now? Caleb prompted when she trailed off, unable to articulate the transformation that had occurred so gradually she'd scarcely noticed until this moment of enforced proximity. Now you're teaching my son card games and carrying my daughter to bed, Emma finished. Checking livestock in blizzards and fixing things I didn't even realize needed repair. Practical matters, Caleb observed, though his tone suggested he understood she meant something more. Yes, Emma agreed, but also belonging. You fit here in ways I wouldn't have thought possible when we made our arrangement. The admission cost her something, pride perhaps, or the defensive wall she'd maintained around her heart since William's death. Caleb seemed to recognize both the concession and its difficulty, for his expression softened into something that wasn't quite a smile, but conveyed similar warmth. Life takes unexpected turns, he said quietly. Sometimes they lead places we never imagined going. The simple statement, philosophical without being pretentious, acknowledged the peculiarity of their situation without reducing it to mere practicality. This shared understanding that their arrangement had evolved beyond its original parameters in ways neither had anticipated created a moment of connection that transcended words. Outside, the storm continued its furious assault, snow and wind combining in a primal force that isolated their small homestead from the wider world. Yet within these walls, something equally powerful had taken root. Not the passionate romance of Emma's girlhood dreams, but something more mature and complex. Trust, perhaps. Understanding, the recognition of unexpected compatibility despite circumstances that should have made such connection impossible. Good night, Caleb, she said finally, retreating before emotions she wasn't prepared to name could overwhelm her. Good night, Emma, he replied, his voice carrying a gentleness that followed her into sleep despite the storm's continuing fury beyond their sheltering walls. Sleep proved elusive despite Emma's exhaustion. The storm's relentless assault, combined with the unsettling conversation before retiring, left her mind too active for rest. After an hour of tossing beneath the quilts, listening to the wind's mournful keening around the eaves, she surrendered to wakefulness. The bedroom felt unusually cold. Perhaps the fire had died down more quickly than expected. Emma slipped from beneath the covers, wrapping her woolen shawl tightly around her nightdress before venturing into the darkened hallway. A faint glow from the kitchen guided her steps, lamp light when all should have been darkness. She paused at the kitchen threshold, momentarily arrested by the tableau before her. Caleb stood at the window, his tall frame silhouetted against the night-dark glass. A single lamp burned low on the table, its golden light catching the strong planes of his profile as he gazed out at the storm. In one hand he held a steaming cup, in the other William's pocket watch, the silver timepiece Emma had shown him just days before, admitting her discovery of the hidden map that might lead to evidence against the Harringtons. Something in his posture, the unusual stillness, the contemplative angle of his head, suggested he was seeing far beyond the swirling snow outside. Emma hesitated, suddenly uncertain whether to intrude on what appeared to be a private moment of reflection. Before she could retreat, Caleb spoke without turning. Can't sleep either? His awareness of her presence didn't surprise her. In the weeks they'd lived under the same roof, Emma had noticed his almost preternatural alertness to his surroundings, a quality that had likely served him well in his outlaw life. The wind, she explained, moving fully into the kitchen. It always sounds like lost souls in a storm like this. Caleb turned from the window, setting the watch carefully on the windowsill. My mother used to say the same thing. She'd make hot milk with cinnamon on stormy nights, claiming it would keep the banshees at bay. The casual mention of his mother, only the second time he'd referenced her in Emma's presence, felt significant, an offering of personal history he normally kept closely guarded. Did it work? She asked, moving to the stove where coals still glowed beneath the cast iron. A smile ghosted across his features. I never heard any banshees, so I suppose it did. Emma found the milk jug and a small saucepan, the familiar motions of heating milk, providing comforting routine in the strange intimacy of midnight kitchen confidences. Was she Irish then, your mother? Pennsylvania Dutch, actually, Caleb replied, leaning against the window frame. But she had a fondness for Celtic legends, said they explained the world better than most sermons. She sounds like an unusual woman, Emma observed, stirring the warming milk. She was. Something softened in Caleb's expression, memory momentarily replacing his habitual guardedness. Independent-minded at a time when that wasn't encouraged in women. Educated when female schooling was considered mostly unnecessary. She taught in a one-room schoolhouse for years before meeting my father. Emma tried to picture it. A young woman not unlike herself, teaching children in some small Pennsylvania settlement, her life stretching predictably before her until chance or fate intervened. How did they meet? He was surveying for the railroad, Caleb said, his gaze turning distant. Stopped to ask directions and found her teaching children about the Oregon Trail using maps she'd drawn herself. Said he'd never seen anything so captivating as her enthusiasm for places she'd never been. And they married? Not immediately. Caleb moved to the table, setting down his cup. My mother wasn't easily persuaded to abandon her independence. It took him 3 proposals and a promise she could continue teaching even after marriage, a radical notion in those days. But she accepted, eventually, Emma noted, adding a pinch of cinnamon to the milk before pouring it into 2 cups. People can surprise you, Caleb agreed, accepting the offered cup with a nod of thanks, especially when they find something worth changing for. The observation hung between them, laden with implications neither seemed prepared to pursue directly. Emma settled across from him at the table, cradling her cup for warmth. Did you have siblings? She asked, steering toward safer waters. A sister, Caleb replied. Helen, 8 years younger. She married a physician in Denver before... He trailed off, the unfinished sentence suggesting another loss. Before your parents died? Emma guessed softly. Caleb nodded, his expression closing slightly. She and I weren't close by then. She disapproved of my choices after the war. My slide into, he gestured vaguely, encompassing his current circumstances, outlawry, Emma supplied, the blunt words somewhat softened by the warmth of cinnamon milk and midnight confession. Yes. He met her gaze directly, a challenge in his blue eyes. Though that wasn't how it began. After losing the ranch, I tried legal channels first. Filed complaints with territorial officials, petitioned for investigation into the Harringtons' business practices. His mouth twisted into a humorous smile. Learned quickly that justice has a price, and the Harringtons could always pay more than I could. So you turned to robbery, Emma concluded, taking directly what the law wouldn't return to you. An oversimplification, but essentially accurate. Caleb's fingers tapped a restless rhythm against his cup. The first time was pure desperation. A Harrington payroll wagon, minimally guarded. I told myself it was reclamation, not theft. Just taking back what was reclamation, not theft. Just taking back what was rightfully mine. And after that? After that, it became something else. The admission carried a weight of self-awareness that surprised Emma. Justified vengeance at first, then... He shrugged. Power has its own allure. Being feared rather than dismissed. Being beyond the reach of corrupt officials and bought judges. A heavy burden to carry, Emma observed quietly. Lighter than you might imagine, until recently. Caleb's gaze when it met hers held unexpected vulnerability. It's distance that makes it possible. Separation from ordinary people leading ordinary lives. Once you start seeing them as individuals rather than abstractions, the weight becomes noticeable. The confession, offered without self-pity or justification, revealed more about Caleb Blackwood than all their previous conversations combined. This man, who had fashioned himself into a notorious outlaw, still possessed enough self-awareness to recognize the moral compromise his choices represented. "I worry about their future," Emma found herself admitting, the midnight hour and howling storm creating a confessional atmosphere that loosened her usual reserve. "James and Sarah, what kind of life they'll have without their father's guidance, whether I'm making the right decisions for them. They're fortunate in their mother," Caleb said with simple conviction. "You've given them stability and love under impossible circumstances. Don't underestimate what that's worth." "It doesn't feel sufficient," Emma sighed. "Especially for James. He needs more than I can provide, a man's example, practical skills that were William's domain." "You've managed admirably," Caleb countered. "And children are resilient. They adapt to circumstances far better than adults imagine." "Like you did?" Emma asked, sensing a connection to his own history. "After your parents died?" Something darkened in Caleb's expression. "My adaptation wasn't particularly admirable. I was older than James, 19 when my parents died, 23 when the war ended. Old enough to make choices with full understanding of their consequences." "And yet here you are," Emma observed softly, "sitting in my kitchen at midnight, drinking cinnamon milk and offering reassurance about my children's futures. Not exactly the behavior one expects from a notorious outlaw." A reluctant smile tugged at his mouth. "As I said, people can surprise you, sometimes even themselves." The wind howled with renewed fury outside, rattling the windows in their frames. Yet within the kitchen's lamplit circle, a peculiar peace had settled between them, a momentary suspension of pretenses and protective barriers that allowed for genuine connection. "Our arrangement has become more complicated than I anticipated," Emma admitted, voicing the thought that had kept her from sleep. "When you first proposed marriage, everything seemed so clear. A business transaction, temporary and practical. And now?" Caleb prompted when she fell silent. Emma traced the rim of her cup, avoiding his gaze. "Now I find myself confused about what this is. What happens next?" The question that had circled her mind for weeks finally emerged, direct and unavoidable. "What happens when you're fully healed, when spring comes and the road's clear? Will you return to your gang?" Caleb's expression shifted, confidence giving way to something less certain. "Would it matter to you if I did?" The simple question, devoid of his usual self-assurance, hung between them like the storm's suspended snowflakes, frozen in a moment of potential before gravity exerted its inevitable pull. Emma found herself unable to answer, the truth too complicated and frightening to voice aloud. Yes, it would matter. Far more than it should, given their arrangement's practical foundation. The realization that she had come to care what path Caleb chose, that his eventual departure would leave a void beyond the practical assistance he provided, terrified her more than any storm or threat could. "It would affect the children," she said finally, deflecting to safer ground. "They've grown attached to you. I wasn't asking about the children, Emma." Caleb's voice remained gentle, but the intensity of his gaze would permit no evasion. Before she could formulate a response, a particularly violent gust rattled the entire house, sending something crashing from a shelf in the front room. The sudden noise broke the spell of midnight intimacy, returning them abruptly to practical concerns. "I should check that," Caleb said, rising from the table. "Make sure nothing's been damaged." "Yes," Emma agreed, relief and disappointment warring within her as the moment of potential confession passed. "And I should try to sleep. Morning will come regardless of storm or conversation." Caleb paused at the kitchen threshold, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't fully decipher. "Thank you for the milk and the conversation." "You're welcome," Emma replied softly. As she returned to her cold bed, Emma knew that something fundamental had shifted between them. Not dramatically, not irreversibly, but like the first crack in spring ice, presaging changes that could no longer be prevented. only navigated with whatever wisdom and courage one possessed. Morning arrived with startling brilliance. Emma woke to sunlight streaming through her bedroom window, the storm's fury replaced by the crystalline clarity that often followed winter tempests. For a moment, she simply lay beneath her quilts, admiring the way sunbeams transformed ordinary dust motes into floating gold. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of timber adjusting to temperature changes. No childish voices, no kitchen sounds. Emma rose quickly, concerned by the unusual silence. The children were typically early risers, especially after exciting events like blizzards. She dressed efficiently, the previous night's conversation with Caleb a half-remembered dream in the practical light of morning. Whatever confusion or connection the midnight hour had fostered, day brought with it the necessity of routine. Children to feed, livestock to check, storm damage to assess. The front room stood empty, though a freshly built fire crackled cheerfully in the hearth. In the kitchen, Emma found Caleb already up and dressed, pouring coffee into 2 cups. He looked up at her entrance, a moment of uncertainty crossing his features before settling into casual friendliness. "Good morning," he greeted her, offering a steaming cup. "I thought you might need this. The children are still asleep. Storm excitement seems to have worn them out." "Thank you." Emma accepted the coffee, conscious of a new awkwardness between them. The lingering effect of confidences shared in darkness, now facing daylight's more demanding clarity. "Has the storm passed completely?" "Entirely," Caleb confirmed, gesturing toward the window where brilliant sunshine reflected off pristine drifts. "Left about 2 feet of snow, from what I can tell. Road will be impassable for several days at least." Emma moved to the window, gazing out at the transformed landscape. The familiar homestead had vanished beneath smooth white contours, boundaries erased and imperfections hidden by the storm's generous blanket. The barn stood as a dark island in a sea of white, smoke from the chimney indicating Caleb had already checked on the livestock. "It's beautiful," she murmured, the coffee's warmth seeping into her bones as she admired nature's handiwork. "Like the world's been scrubbed clean and started fresh." "An apt description," Caleb agreed, coming to stand beside her at the window, his own coffee cradled in his hands. "Though the beauty hides considerable danger for the unprepared." The simple observation, practical yet appreciative of the view's splendor, exemplified what Emma had come to value in Caleb's perspective. His balance between hard-earned caution and capacity for admiring life's quieter joys. It was this unexpected depth, as much as his practical skills or handsome features, that had gradually undermined her determination to maintain emotional distance. "About last night," she began, feeling the need to address what had passed between them. "You don't need to explain," Caleb interrupted gently. "Midnight conversations during blizzards exist in their own realm, like dreams or prayers, not meant for daylight dissection." The graceful exemption from examining feelings neither seemed fully prepared to acknowledge brought surprising relief. Emma nodded, sipping her coffee to hide a complicated surge of emotions: gratitude for his understanding, disappointment at the reprieve, confusion about what she truly wanted. "I checked the livestock earlier," Caleb continued, moving to more practical matters. "Everyone survived comfortably, though that north corner of the barn will need reinforcement before the next storm. Some snow got through, but not enough to cause real problems." "Thank you," Emma said, genuinely grateful. William would have been up before dawn as well, managing these essential tasks, but the years since his death had taught her how burdensome such responsibilities became when borne alone. "I should start breakfast soon. The children will be hungry when they wake." "No rush," Caleb replied. "Let them sleep a bit longer. After the excitement, He broke off abruptly, his body tensing like a predator scenting threat. Emma followed his suddenly alert gaze through the window, where movement disturbed the pristine snow beyond the yard. Her breath caught as she made out approaching riders, 3 men on horseback, moving with careful deliberation through the deep drifts. "Who?" she whispered, fear blossoming in her chest. Visitors after a blizzard could mean many things, few of them good. Injured travelers seeking aid perhaps, but also opportunists targeting isolated homesteads when help couldn't be summoned. Caleb didn't answer immediately, his eyes narrowed as he assessed the distant figures. His hand moved with casual precision to the gun belt hanging beside the door, fingers checking that his revolver sat properly in its holster before buckling it around his waist. "Stay inside with the children," he ordered, his voice suddenly carrying the hard edge of command that Emma hadn't heard since their earliest encounters. The transformation was remarkable, the considerate companion of recent weeks instantaneously replaced by the dangerous outlaw she'd first discovered in her barn. Fear mingled with a sudden flare of rebellion at being dismissed from decisions affecting her home and family. Emma grasped his arm as he moved toward the door. "Who are they? Your gang or the Harringtons?" Caleb's expression revealed nothing, his features settling into the unreadable mask he'd worn during their earliest interactions. Either way, our arrangement just got more complicated. The statement confirmed Emma's suspicion that he recognized the approaching riders, yet his deliberate ambiguity left her uncertain which threat they faced. Outlaw companions coming to reclaim their leader, or Harrington men pursuing whatever evidence William had hidden. As Caleb moved toward the door, determination crystallized within Emma. This was her home, her children at risk, her future hanging in the balance of whatever confrontation approached through the snow. She would not cower in the bedroom while others determined her fate. "I'm coming with you," she stated, reaching for her shawl. Caleb turned, surprise momentarily cracking his controlled expression. "Emma, this could be dangerous. The children are still asleep and secure," she finished for him, "and I deserve to know who's approaching my home and why. I won't interfere, but I won't be sheltered like a child either." Something flickered in Caleb's eyes. Respect, concern, and perhaps a deeper emotion Emma wasn't prepared to name. Their gazes held for a heartbeat, silent communication passing between them more effectively than words could manage. "Stay behind me," he conceded finally, "and be prepared to get back inside quickly if necessary." Emma nodded, wrapping her shawl more securely around her shoulders as Caleb opened the door. Together they stepped onto the porch, the morning's brilliant sunshine momentarily blinding after the house's dimmer light. Snow sparkled like scattered diamonds across the yard, pristine save for Caleb's earlier tracks to and from the barn. The approaching riders had drawn close enough for details to emerge. 3 men bundled in heavy coats, their faces partially obscured by scarves against the cold, moved their horses carefully through snow that reached the animals' chests in deeper drifts. They carried rifles across their saddles, not unusual for travelers in such conditions, but a detail that heightened Emma's apprehension nonetheless. Caleb's posture remained relaxed, almost casually at ease as he leaned against the porch post. Only Emma, standing close enough to feel the tension in his body, recognized the coiled readiness beneath his apparent nonchalance. His right hand rested near his holstered gun, neither threatening nor unprepared. As the riders approached the yard, the lead figure raised a gloved hand in greeting. "Morning, folks," he called, his voice carrying clearly in the winter still air. "Sorry to disturb you after the storm, checking homesteads for the sheriff." Relief washed through Emma, though Caleb's posture remained unchanged. Taylor had mentioned sending men to check isolated properties once the storm passed, a common practice in mountain communities where blizzards could mean death for the unprepared or unfortunate. The lead rider drew closer, lowering his scarf to reveal a vaguely familiar face. One of Taylor's deputies, Emma thought, though she couldn't immediately recall his name. The other men remained slightly behind, their own features still obscured. "Sheriff sent us to make sure everyone weathered the storm," the deputy explained, reining in his horse at the edge of the yard, "especially those with children." His gaze moved between Emma and Caleb, assessing in a way that suggested more than simple welfare concerns. "Everything all right here, Mrs. Blackwood? You and the little ones made it through without trouble?" The question, directed specifically to Emma rather than Caleb, carried subtle implications that raised her hackles. "We're fine, thank you," she replied firmly. "My husband ensured we were well prepared." She emphasized the word husband deliberately, moving a half step closer to Caleb in unconscious signal of unity. Only as she did so did Emma realize the significance of her instinctive choice. Standing beside Caleb rather than retreating to the safety of the house, aligning herself with him despite lingering uncertainties about his true allegiances. The deputy nodded, though his gaze remained watchful. "Glad to hear it. Sheriff mentioned you'd had some trouble with the Harringtons a while back. Thought they might try taking advantage of the storm's isolation. No sign of them, Caleb replied, his voice carrying just the right note of casual concern appropriate for a homesteader discussing potential threats. Though we appreciate the check. Roads likely to be passable soon? Not for wagons, the deputy answered. Riders can make it through to town if necessary. We've cut a path of sorts. He hesitated, glancing at his companions before continuing. Sheriff also wanted us to mention there's been sightings of outlaws in the area. Blackwood gang's been spotted north of here. The name hung in the crystal air, a deliberate probe disguised as friendly warning. Emma felt Caleb's infinitesimal stillness beside her, the only indication that the reference had struck home. Appreciate the warning, he replied evenly, though I suspect they've got better things to do than bother isolated homesteads. Maybe so, the deputy agreed. Still, best keep your rifle handy, Mr. Blackwood. Strange coincidence you sharing a name with that bunch. Not so strange, Caleb countered smoothly. Common enough surname back east, though it's caused some awkward moments since arriving here. I'll admit. The exchange carried undercurrents Emma could sense but not fully decipher. Professional suspicion meeting practiced deflection in a dance as old as law and outlawry themselves. She found herself holding her breath, acutely aware that their carefully constructed life, balanced on Caleb's ability to maintain his cattle buyer persona. Well, we won't keep you folks, the deputy said finally, apparently satisfied by their inspection. Tell the children Sheriff Taylor sends his regards, and if you need anything before the road's clear, just fire 3 shots. Someone'll hear and come check. Much obliged, Caleb replied, the slight sharpening of his tone suggesting he recognized the offer of assistance doubled as surveillance. The men turned their horses, beginning the laborious process of breaking trail back toward town. Emma remained beside Caleb on the porch, conscious of being watched until the riders disappeared beyond the nearest rise, their dark figures gradually swallowed by the brilliant white landscape. Only when they were truly gone did Caleb's posture relax, a soft exhalation escaping him as tension ebbed. That wasn't a routine welfare check, he observed, quietly. No, Emma agreed, the morning's bright promise now shadowed by renewed concerns. Taylor's suspicious. He's having you watched. Having us watched, Caleb corrected. He's as concerned about your welfare as my identity, hence directing questions specifically to you. The observation was accurate, though it provided small comfort. If Taylor's suspicions continued growing, their precarious arrangement could collapse, with consequences Emma preferred not to contemplate. Caleb arrested or killed, herself possibly implicated in harboring a known criminal, the children left vulnerable once again. What will you do? She asked, facing him directly. If your gang is truly nearby, if they come looking for you, what then? The question echoed their midnight conversation, though now weighted with immediate rather than theoretical concern. Caleb studied her face, his expression thoughtful rather than guarded. That depends, he said finally. On what? On whether I have something worth staying for. The simple answer, laden with implications neither had directly acknowledged, stole Emma's breath more effectively than the cold morning air. They stood in arrested stillness, the moment suspended between them like one of the ice crystals glittering in the sunshine. Beautiful, fragile, and inevitably temporary. Before Emma could formulate a response, the door behind them creaked open. Sarah stood in the doorway, tousle-hayed and sleepy-eyed in her nightgown, clutching her rag doll against her chest. "Mama, why are you outside? Is the storm gone?" The child's innocent question broke the crystalline moment, returning them abruptly to the practical world of breakfast and chores and childhood needs. Yet as they turned together to usher Sarah back inside, Emma felt Caleb's hand briefly touch the small of her back, a gesture so natural she might have imagined it had she not seen the warmth in his eyes when their gazes met over Sarah's head. Something fundamental had shifted between them, as surely as the storm had transformed the landscape overnight. What shape their relationship might take remained uncertain, subject to threats both known and yet to emerge. But Emma found herself facing these possibilities with unexpected hope rather than fear. A sentiment as bright and unexpected as the morning sunshine after the blizzard's fury.